the sky above Satan City had seen strange things. It had witnessed the aftermath of Cell's games, the shadow of Majin Buu's resurrection, the distant tremors of battles that rewrote the laws of physics in real time. The people of Satan City had learned, over years of collective trauma and Hercule Satan's enthusiastic revisionist history, to look up with a particular mixture of dread and exhausted familiarity whenever the clouds started doing something they shouldn't. But no one had ever seen the sky bleed before. It started just after noon on an ordinary Tuesday, when the air above the central district split open like a wound that had been festering on the other side of reality for a very long time. The rift was not clean. It was not the crisp, geometric portal of advanced technology or the elegant shimmer of godly transportation. It was ragged and wrong, its edges burning with a cold fire that existed somewhere between deep purple and absolute black, a color that had no business existing in a universe built on sunlight and the warm gold of powering up Kai. The sound it made was worse than the sight, a low, grinding moan that resonated in the chest cavity, in the back teeth, in some primal part of the human brain that remembered being prey in the dark. People stopped walking. Cars drifted to a halt. A vendor selling roasted chestnuts on the corner of 5th and Meridian watched his cart begin to shake, the chestnuts rattling against each other like teeth, and decided correctly that this was an excellent moment to be somewhere else entirely. Then Spawn fell through. He hit the pavement of the central plaza with enough force to crater it, sending a shockwave of displaced air outward in all directions, flipping food stalls and scattering pedestrians like leaves in a hurricane. The impact left a depression in the reinforced concrete 3 meters wide and half a meter deep, the edges scorched black by the residual energy of whatever dimensional passage had just spat him out. He landed in a crouch that was more controlled than it had any right to be given the circumstances, one gauntleted fist driven into the ground. His massive cape, Letha, though no one here knew her name, yet spreading behind him like the wings of something that had crawled out of the collective nightmare of every civilization that had ever feared the dark. For a moment, he didn't move. Al Simmons, Spawn, stayed crouched in the crater he'd made and took in the world around him with the trained assessment of a man who had once been the finest soldier the CIA ever produced, and the harder-won wariness of a man who had since died, gone to hell, bargained with a demon, and spent years navigating a war between heaven and hell that neither side had the decency to be honest about. His senses, sharpened beyond anything human by 5 years of necroplasm and supernatural combat, swept the area in seconds. Wrong, everything was wrong. Not dangerous wrong, not the specific wrongness of a violator ambush or Mailbulge's sulfur-thick presence pressing against the back of his skull. This was different. The air tasted different. The energy flowing through this world, and there was energy here, vast rivers of it, humming through the ground and crackling faintly in the atmosphere like a planet-sized electrical current, was utterly unlike anything he'd encountered in his own universe. It wasn't hellfire. It wasn't divine light. It wasn't the cold necroplasm that fueled his own existence. It was something warm and vital and almost aggressively alive, like the universe itself was breathing. He'd never felt anything like it, and that alone made him dangerous, because Spawn in unfamiliar territory was Spawn at his most volatile. He straightened slowly, the cape settling around him, and looked up at the faces staring at him from the edges of the plaza. They stared back. A child somewhere in the crowd, because there is always a child in every version of every story, who has not yet learned to be afraid of the appropriate things, pointed and said, with great confidence, "Cool costume." Spawn looked at the child for a long moment. "Thanks, kid," he said, his voice a low rasp that carried the particular texture of a man who had spent too long speaking to things that did not respond well to kindness. "Now go home." The child's mother grabbed them and ran. So did most of the others. The emergency alert systems kicked in approximately 40 seconds after Spawn's arrival, a testament either to Satan City's emergency response protocols or to the general alertness of a population that had been through enough to know that when something lands in the middle of your city with enough force to crack the street, you escalate immediately. Police cordons began forming at the plaza's edges. Helicopters, 3 of them, appeared over the rooftops within 2 minutes, their spotlights cutting through the haze of dust and necroplasm residue that still hung in the air around the impact site. From the lead helicopter, a voice crackled through a megaphone with the specific tone of someone following a script they hadn't written and didn't fully believe in. Unidentified individual, you are in violation of Public Safety Ordinance 7 Alpha. Please identify yourself and remain stationary. Any hostile action will be met with. With what? Spawn said, not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. The cape moved just slightly, and the sound of his voice carried in ways that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the necroplasm that wove through every cell of his existence. The pilot of the lead helicopter actually flinched, visible even from 100 meters up. What exactly do you think you're going to do? It wasn't a threat. That was the thing about Spawn that most people misread in the first 30 seconds of meeting him. It wasn't bravado or aggression. It was a genuine question, asked by a man who had been shot by every caliber of bullet that existed and several that technically shouldn't, who had been stabbed with weapons blessed by actual angels, who had stood in the presence of the deity responsible for Earth's existence, and told him to his face to get out of his city. He wasn't asking because he wanted to hurt anyone. He was asking because he needed to establish the parameters of the situation, and the fastest way to do that was to let people demonstrate their intentions. The helicopter banked away, the pilot making a sensible executive decision. The police cordon held, but barely. Spawn turned slowly, taking in the full sweep of the city. It was a good city, from what he could see, well-maintained, human-scaled in the way that modern cities sometimes forgot to be, with a stadium visible to the northeast and what looked like a substantial martial arts arena complex to the west. He'd landed in what appeared to be a prosperous commercial district, which explained the density of pedestrians and the quality of the infrastructure he'd just cratered. In the distance, actual mountains, blue with distance, their peaks touched with snow, a river catching the afternoon light to the east. Not his world, not even close to his world. But whoever's world it was inhabited by people who deserved not to have their Tuesday destroyed. He reached out with his senses, not the physical senses, but the deeper perception that 5 years of supernatural warfare had ground into him, the ability to read the spiritual temperature of a place the way a sailor reads weather. What he found made him go very still. There were souls here, everywhere of course, because souls went everywhere people went. But there was also an infrastructure, an organized system for managing them, running like a set of invisible highways through the metaphysical bedrock of this universe. Channels and pathways, and what he could only describe as administrative presence, vast bureaucratic structures for handling the dead. It was the most orderly afterlife management he'd ever sensed, and given that he'd spent years dealing with heaven and hell's considerably less orderly versions, the contrast was striking. It also meant that this universe had its own divine authority, which meant his presence here was already causing someone somewhere a significant amount of paperwork. Good, he thought. He'd been causing heaven's accountants grief for years. Might as well expand his demographic. He became aware of a new presence approximately 3 seconds before it arrived, which was 3 seconds longer than most beings in this universe would have gotten. The Kai signature was warm and enormous and cheerful in a way that energy had absolutely no business being, like a bonfire that had achieved sentience, and decided its primary purpose was to make everyone around it feel welcome. It came from the east, and it came fast, dropping from altitude with the casual confidence of someone who had long since stopped finding high-speed flight impressive. Son Goku landed at the edge of the crater. He was not what Spawn expected. Spawn had encountered cosmic-level beings before, angels with power that bent reality, demons whose presence made the air thick with wrongness, a deity who wore the sun like a hat. They all announced themselves. They all carried the weight of their power like a physical thing, pressing outward, demanding acknowledgement. This man, and he was clearly a man, or something close enough to make no difference, wore his power like a comfortable shirt. It was simply there, vast and easy and undemonstrative, as natural to him as breathing. He was dressed in orange, which was perhaps the least threatening color available, and he was looking at Spawn with an expression that contained absolutely zero of the fear, calculation, or hostility that Spawn had come to expect as the standard opening to most of his interactions. He looked curious, genuinely, openly, uncomplicated curious. "Hey," said Goku. Spawn stared at him. "Hey," he said finally, because there was genuinely no other appropriate response. "That was a pretty impressive entrance," Goku said, nodding toward the crater. "I felt your energy from way out on the East Road. It's really different from anything I've sensed before. Kind of dark, but not like Babidi dark or Frieza dark. More like..." He tilted his head the way a dog does when it hears an unfamiliar sound. "Like something old, really old. What kind of Kai is that?" "It's not Kai," Spawn said. "Huh?" Goku processed this for roughly half a second and then smiled, bright and completely unguarded. "Cool. What is it?" Spawn had been doing this long enough to recognize a genuinely fearless person when he met one, and to distinguish them from the other category of people who didn't show fear, the ones who were simply too calculating to let it show. Goku was the former. Whatever this man was, whatever power he carried, he was looking at Spawn with the uncomplicated delight of someone who had just been handed a puzzle he was very much looking forward to solving. It was, in a way Spawn had not been prepared for, disarming. "It's complicated," Spawn said. "I like complicated," Goku said. "I'm Goku, son Goku. Are you okay?" That looked like it hurt. "It didn't." "Okay." Goku glanced at the crater, then back at Spawn. "Are you from around here?" "No. Different universe." Spawn blinked. "You get a lot of that." Goku laughed, not the carefully modulated laugh of someone performing warmth for social purposes, but the full, uncalculated laugh of someone who found something genuinely funny. "More than you'd think. This keeps happening. Last guy who showed up from somewhere else almost destroyed the planet, so you know, no pressure, just want to check. You planning on destroying anything?" Spawn looked at the crater he'd made. "Not on purpose," he said. "That's better than average," Goku said, with apparent sincerity. "I'm going to tell my friends you're not a threat. Just try not to do anything that looks too threatening while I convince them. Vegeta's watching from about 3 kilometers north, and he's been in a bad mood since breakfast." Spawn turned his head. He couldn't see anything in the direction Goku had indicated, but he reached out with his senses and found it immediately. Another Kai signature, this one colder and more compressed than Goku's. A concentrated point of immense power wrapped in something that felt very much like pride being held at a controlled temperature. Watching. Assessing. "Tell him to take a number," Spawn said. Goku grinned. "I like you," he said, with the same easy certainty he seemed to bring to everything. "You want to get something to eat? There's a place around the corner that does incredible ramen." And that was how the most dangerous supernatural warrior in his home universe ended up being escorted to a ramen shop by the most powerful being in this one. While overhead, 3 separate intelligence services that were definitely not human scrambled to figure out what, exactly, had just fallen through a hole in the sky above Satan City, and in a dimension that was neither up nor down but simply elsewhere. An immense and ancient bureaucratic structure began to shake. In King Yemma's office, every stamp on every desk rattled simultaneously. The massive Oni bureaucrat looked up from his paperwork, which was, as always, extraordinary in its volume, and stared at the readout on the soul tracking system that had been running continuously since the dawn of the universe. The system had flagged an anomaly. Not a new soul, not a soul that had died and was waiting for processing. Something else entirely, something the system had no category for. A soul that existed in full, living presence in the mortal realm, that carried the full weight of death and hell's ownership paperwork simultaneously. That was generating necroplasm energy at a rate that was making the atmospheric spiritual sensors go haywire. King Yemma read the anomaly report twice. Then he pressed the emergency communication channel to the Grand Kai's office, something he had done exactly 3 times in his long career, each time preceding a crisis of civilizational proportion. "We have a situation," he said, when the connection opened. Far to the north of Satan City, in a gravity chamber on a clifftop property that represented years of hard-won domestic compromise, Vegeta stood before a bank of sensor equipment and stared at the readings with the focused intensity of a man who had spent his entire life calibrating himself against the most powerful forces in existence. The readings made no sense. Not wrong, no sense. The way a broken instrument made no sense. More precisely wrong, the way a measurement makes no sense when you're trying to apply the wrong units. The energy this newcomer was emitting was genuinely not expressible in the Kai-based framework that all of Vegeta's instruments were calibrated for. It wasn't suppressed Kai. It wasn't a variation of Kai. It was something his instruments were trying to translate into familiar terms and failing completely, returning readouts that kept cycling through error states, and then, apparently in desperation, simply printing the word unknown in large letters. Vegeta had destroyed 3 training robots that morning already. He reached for his communicator, then stopped. Kakarot was already down there, talking to it. Of course he was. Vegeta turned back to his instruments, jaw tight, and began running the analysis from a different angle. If he couldn't measure the energy directly, he could measure its effects, the resonance it was creating in the surrounding spiritual environment, the way it was interacting with, or more precisely, not interacting with, maintaining a strange, complete isolation from the background Kai that permeated this universe like oxygen permeated air. Whatever had landed in Satan City was not from this universe. And it was not, whatever Kakarot's cheerful assessment might be, not a threat. Everything was a threat until proven otherwise. That was not pessimism. That was a principle that had kept Vegeta alive through scenarios that had no right to have survivors. He began drafting a message to Bulma. He needed better instruments. Meanwhile, in a region of space that operated on principles beyond the ken of most mortals, in a chamber where the air smelled of something ancient and clean, and utterly without mercy, 2 figures sat in the particular quality of stillness that belongs exclusively to beings who have simply run out of things that can surprise them. Until now, Whis tapped his staff gently against the floor of Beerus's planet, watching the energy readings scroll across the crystal sphere that served as his monitoring device, and allowed himself a small, considered expression that, on his ordinarily serene face, registered as equivalent to a normal person's jaw dropping. "Oh my," he said softly. Beerus opened one eye from his nap. "What?" "Something rather interesting has just appeared in Universe 7, Whis said. "In a city on Earth specifically." "Earth again?" Beerus sat up, both eyes open now, his large ears tilting forward with the focused attention of a predator that had just caught an unfamiliar scent. "It's always Earth. What is it this time?" Whis studied the readings for a long moment. "I'm not entirely certain," he said, which was itself remarkable because Whis was almost always entirely certain. "But I believe the appropriate word might be Hellspawn." Beerus stared at his attendant. "A Hellspawn," he repeated. "Quite a powerful one by the readings." Whis tilted his head with an expression of serene academic interest. Its energy signature is unlike anything in our universe's cataloged phenomena. Fascinating, really. It appears to exist in a kind of simultaneous state, alive and dead, divine and infernal all at once, rather like a philosophical paradox given physical form. Beerus was quiet for a moment. Is it going to be a problem? Wise considered this with the careful thoughtfulness of someone calculating a very complex equation. That, he said finally, depends entirely on what Son Goku says to it over the next few hours. He paused. So probably yes. In the ramen shop around the corner from the crater, Spawn sat across from Goku and watched him demolish his third bowl with the focused dedication of a man for whom eating was a spiritual practice. The shop had emptied of other customers within approximately 90 seconds of their arrival. The proprietor, a small, practical woman in her 50s, having taken one look at Spawn and then looked at Goku, identified him as someone who had been in and out of the shop for years, and made the executive decision that if he was sitting across from whatever this was calmly asking for extra chashu pork, it was probably going to be fine. She'd left them the restaurant and retired to the kitchen, where she was definitely not listening intently to every word of their conversation. "So you don't know how you got here," Goku said. It wasn't quite a question. "Something tore," Spawn said. He'd ordered nothing. He didn't eat. He was sitting with his cape drawn around him, filling the booth in a way that had less to do with physical size and more to do with the specific quality of presence that years of supernatural warfare had deposited in his posture. "I was in the middle of something. Fight with a demon lord, don't ask. There was an energy discharge. When I came through, I was here." "Demon lord," Goku said thoughtfully. "We've had those, kind of. Dabura was one. He turned people to stone by spitting on them." Spawn stared at him. "That's not how demon lords usually work," he said. "I thought it was pretty creative," Goku said. He set down his chopsticks and looked at Spawn with that same open, direct attention. "Okay, so, you're from a different universe, you got here by accident and you want to go home." "Eventually," Spawn said. "I want to understand where I am first. Going back through a dimensional tier without knowing the coordinates is a good way to end up somewhere worse than where you started." "Smart," Goku said. "Bulma can probably help with that. She's really good with dimensional stuff. She built a machine that lets you travel to parallel universes. Well, she built it with some help, but mostly her." He smiled. "She'll want to run tests on you, though, just warning you." "People always want to run tests on me," Spawn said. He said it without particular bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of long experience. "Usually right before they try to either capture me or kill me." Goku looked at him for a moment. "That sounds really exhausting." Spawn blinked. Of all the things he'd expected from this conversation, simple human empathy delivered without agenda or performance was not among them. He found himself recalibrating. "It is," he said. "Well," Goku said, picking up his chopsticks again, "nobody here is going to try to capture or kill you. I mean, Vegeta might challenge you to a fight pretty soon. That's basically just how he says hello, but that's different." "Is it?" "He doesn't actually want to kill you. He just wants to see what you can do," Goku grinned. "So do I, honestly. That energy of yours, it's unlike anything. It's like trying to listen to music that exists in a frequency you've never heard before. It's there, it's real, but everything I used to understand Kai just sort of." He waved his chopsticks expressively. "Slides off it." Spawn considered this. He reached out slightly with his own senses and found Goku's Kai again. Found it the way you find a bonfire in the dark, instantly and without effort. Up close, it was even more impressive. Layered, multiple distinct registers of power sitting inside each other like a set of nested containers, each one more fundamental than the last. He recognized the shape of a being who had pushed themselves repeatedly to the edge of what was possible, and then past it, not through any single gift or inheritance, but through a kind of relentless, stubborn engagement with the limits of the self. He knew that shape. He'd seen it in the mirror, in the version of himself that existed before death. "Your energy," Spawn said slowly. "It's alive. Not just energy, it's like it has a will." Goku looked surprised and pleased. "That's basically what Kai is, yeah, it's life force. It responds to the person using it." He paused. "What about yours?" Spawn was quiet for a moment. "Mine is borrowed," he said finally, "from hell with interest." The word interest landed in the small space between them with a particular weight that Goku, to his credit, seemed to feel. He didn't push. He simply nodded slowly, with the expression of someone filing information away for careful later consideration rather than immediate response. Outside in the plaza, the emergency services were cautiously approaching the crater. Helicopters circled. Somewhere in the organizational structure of Earth's defense apparatus, phones were ringing. In a clifftop gravity room, Vegeta was building a better instrument. In the afterlife bureaucracy, King Yemma was filing emergency requests that had not needed to be filed in 10,000 years. And somewhere much further away, in the cold dark at the edge of the dimensional wound that Spawn had torn in his passage, something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this kind of opening began, very slowly, to look through. If you want to see more dark, unstoppable warriors colliding with Dragon Ball's universe of gods and monsters, hit that subscribe button and drop what character you want to see enter the Dragon Ball universe next in the comments below. The battle is just getting started. The Capsule Corporation complex had seen strange things arrive at its front gate. It had received visits from androids, from time travelers, from a pink blob of pure magical evil that had absorbed two people Bulma genuinely liked, from a god of destruction who had demanded pudding, and nearly ended the planet when the supply ran short. Bulma Brief had, over the course of her extraordinary life, developed a remarkably calibrated threat assessment system that operated on a completely different axis from most people's. Most people assess threats by appearance. Bulma assessed them by the quality of attention they paid to their surroundings. Spawn, standing at the entrance to the main research building, while Goku handled the security checkpoint with his usual cheerful disregard for the actual security procedures, was paying the kind of attention to his surroundings that she recognized immediately. Not the wide-eyed scanning of someone lost and overwhelmed, not the predatory sweeping assessment of someone planning an attack vector, the specific, methodical, layered attention of someone who had survived a very long time in environments where missing a detail meant dying, the attention of a professional. Bulma was at the front entrance before Goku finished explaining to the security system why it should let them through. "You're the one who landed in Satan City," she said, looking up at Spawn with the direct, appraising gaze of a woman who had looked Frieza in the face and decided that the most useful thing she could do was keep her hands steady. "Yes," Spawn said. "Interesting arrival vector. The dimensional resonance was detectable from here, about 300 kilometers." She had a tablet in one hand and was already pulling up readings. "The energy signature was completely outside our normal measurement parameters. What's your power source?" Spawn looked at her for a moment. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "Should I be? Most people are." Bulma shrugged with the magnificent confidence of someone who had been married to Vegeta for over a decade and had survived it through a combination of intelligence, stubbornness, and a complete refusal to be impressed by things that were merely dangerous. "Goku sat across from you in a restaurant for 2 hours. If you were going to do something horrible, you would have done it already. Come inside, I need blood samples, energy readings, and a complete account of your origin universe's physical laws." Spawn followed her inside. "I'm not giving blood samples," he said. "Fine tissue samples." "No. Energy readings." "Possibly." "Progress," Bulma said without breaking stride. "Goku said your energy is non-Kai based. That's genuinely fascinating. We've encountered a few energy types outside standard Kai, the Force, during that dimensional overlap 3 years ago, divine energy from the Grand Kai circuit, but nothing that reads the way yours does. She glanced back at him. It registered on our instruments as simultaneously alive and dead, like a superposition state. Is that accurate? Spawn considered the question with more genuine interest than he'd expected to feel. More or less, I'm dead. I've been dead for years. The energy that keeps me functional is from hell necroplasm. It's essentially the processed life force of damned souls converted into a power source. He paused. That sentence sounds worse out loud than it does in my head. A little bit, Bulma agreed, leading him into a laboratory that occupied most of the building's third floor, filled with equipment that managed to be simultaneously highly advanced and highly organized in a way that spoke of a mind that was equally comfortable with theory and practice. But scientifically interesting. So you're essentially running on a form of processed spiritual energy. That would explain the superposition readings. You exist in both the living and dead states simultaneously, because your physical body is sustained by energy that belongs to the afterlife domain. I've never heard it put that way. Does it seem accurate? Spawn thought about it. Yeah, he said. Actually, yeah. Good. She set down her tablet and turned to face him fully. Here's my concern. This universe has a very organized afterlife infrastructure. King Yemma manages soul processing for this universe, and the system is calibrated for specific types of soul energy interactions. You landing here with a full living body, sustained by what is essentially misappropriated afterlife energy, is going to create administrative problems that are going to attract attention from beings who are significantly less easygoing about it than I am. Spawn stared at her. You know about your afterlife infrastructure, he said. I've died twice, Bulma said. You learn things. Before Spawn could respond to this, the laboratory door opened and Vegeta walked in. He did not knock. Vegeta had never in his life knocked on a door in his own home, and he was not going to establish the precedent now regardless of what supernatural entity was standing in his wife's laboratory. He walked in with his arms crossed and his expression set to the particular configuration that meant he had been thinking carefully about something and had arrived at conclusions he was prepared to defend. He looked at Spawn. Spawn looked at Vegeta. There was a moment of the specific calibrating silence that passes between beings of significant power when they first encounter each other. Not aggression, not immediately, but the unconscious process of assessment, the deep instinctive reading of threat level and capability, and the particular quality of danger the other person represented. Vegeta uncrossed his arms. Your energy, he said without preamble. My instruments couldn't measure it, not because it was too strong, because it's in a different framework entirely. His eyes narrowed slightly. What are you? Hellspawn, Spawn said. That tells me what you're called, not what you are. Spawn tilted his head slightly. Despite himself, he felt a flicker of something he recognized as respect. Direct. No performance. No posturing beyond the structural kind that was simply built into the man's bearing. I'm a dead man walking, he said. Sustained by Hell's energy, equipped with a symbiotic suit that has its own intelligence, capable of manipulating the supernatural energies of my home universe in ways that don't translate neatly into whatever your framework here is. Magic, Vegeta said, with the specific disdain of a man who had spent years finding magic categorically irritating precisely because it refused to follow rules. Not exactly. It has some similarities, but magic in my world is mostly about knowledge and willpower, knowing the right words, having the right intent. This is more fundamental than that. It's a property of the substance itself. Spawn held up one gauntleted hand and let a small tendril of necroplasm energy surface at his fingertips. Not a threat display, just a demonstration. The energy was dark and cold and moved with a quality that was entirely unlike Kai, slower and heavier and somehow more certain, like gravity rather than electricity. Vegeta watched it with focused attention. "It's not suppressed Kai," he said, "and it's not the magical energy Babidi used. I've felt both." He was quiet for a moment. "It feels like something from outside." "Because it is," Spawn said. "Where I come from, heaven and hell are real, organized, competing powers. I work for neither or both, depending on the day." He let the energy recede. "In your universe, how does that work? Heaven and hell?" Vegeta and Bulma exchanged a look. "We have an afterlife," Bulma said carefully. "Hell exists here as a place of containment for powerful evil souls. It's more of a prison than a source of power. Heaven is more of a training ground for worthy souls. Neither of them is a political entity the way you seem to be describing. So nobody is running an army of damned souls toward an apocalypse." "Not that we know of," Bulma said, "though the weak is young." Spawn was quiet for a moment, processing this. The shape of it, an afterlife that was administrative rather than militarized, that managed souls as a bureaucratic function rather than as a resource to be weaponized, was genuinely alien to everything his experience had taught him. He found it strange in the specific way that peace feels strange to someone who has only known war. He also found it, in a way he wasn't entirely prepared to examine, something close to relieving. The first recruitment attempt came from S.H.I.E.L.D.'s Dragon Ball universe, equivalent approximately 6 hours after Spawn's arrival. They didn't call themselves S.H.I.E.L.D. here. The Earth Defense Force's Special Anomaly Response Division operated out of a nondescript facility on the outskirts of Satan City and spent most of its time documenting the aftermath of battles between beings who could level mountains, writing reports that were classified at levels most of their own government wasn't cleared for, and occasionally making very polite requests of people like Goku that were very politely ignored. Commander Hana Sato was 43 years old, had spent 15 of those years studying the intersection of extraordinary human ability and institutional response, and had developed, out of sheer professional necessity, an extremely high tolerance for situations that had no precedent. She arrived at Capsule Corporation in an official vehicle with 2 aides and a briefcase full of documentation, and was met at the door by Bulma, who had clearly been expecting exactly this. "I need to speak with the entity that arrived this morning," Sato said. "He has a name," Bulma said, "Spawn, and he doesn't have to speak with you." "I understand that. I'm not here to compel anything." Sato's voice was careful and professional. "I'm here to make an offer." Spawn, who had been standing near the laboratory window watching the city, turned to look at her when she was brought in. Sato, to her considerable credit, did not visibly react to the full impact of his presence at close range, though she did become very still in the way that people become still when their nervous system is overriding their trained composure's objections. "You represent a government," Spawn said. "Earth's primary anomaly response coordination structure," Sato said. "We track extraordinary events, manage public response, provide logistical support to independent operators." "You study things that shouldn't exist and try to make them useful," Spawn said. "I've dealt with organizations like yours before." "Then you know we can also provide resources," Sato said. "Information on this universe's geography, history, power structures, assistance with." "She also has people listening to this conversation from a vehicle outside," Spawn said. "And someone in your organization made a call 40 minutes ago to a party I'm going to guess you describe as a private contractor who specializes in capturing metahuman class threats." Silence. Sato's composure held, but only just. "That was a precautionary measure," she said carefully. "Sure," Spawn said. "Tell whoever's coming that I'd rather they didn't. I'd rather not break anyone today." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want to be studied. I don't want to be useful to you. I want to understand where I am, figure out how I got here, and eventually go home. I'm not a threat to your world unless someone makes me one. Pass that along." Sato studied him for a long moment. Then she picked up her briefcase, closed it, and nodded once. "I'll communicate your position," she said. "For what it's worth, the precautionary contractor has been stood down. I made that call when I walked in and got a better read on the situation." She left. Goku, who had been sitting on a lab bench eating an apple through the entire exchange, watched her go and then looked at Spawn. "You knew about the team outside." "The moment they arrived," Spawn said. "Huh," Goku finished the apple core and all. "You know, you remind me of someone." "Who?" "Android 16, Goku said. "He was built to fight, but what he actually wanted was to be left alone and watch birds." He paused. "I don't think you want to watch birds, but the vibe is similar." Spawn stared at him. "The vibe," he repeated. "Yeah." Despite everything, despite the dimensional displacement and the unfamiliar universe and the cosmic bureaucratic crisis he was apparently causing simply by existing, despite all of it, Spawn found the corner of his mouth moving in something that might, in the right light, have been the very preliminary structural component of a smile. He killed it immediately. But it had been there. The second recruitment attempt was less polite. It came in the form of a message delivered to Capsule Corporation's communications system at approximately 11 that evening, a time chosen with the specific calculation of someone who understood that late-night communication carries an implicit pressure that daytime communication doesn't. The message was text only, routed through 17 different relay points in a way that was technically sophisticated and practically unnecessary given that Bulma identified the source in about 4 minutes. The Frieza Force remnants. Not Frieza himself. He was currently alive and technically allied with Universe 7 in an uneasy arrangement that everyone involved found distasteful, and no one had found a better alternative to. But the outer edges of his former empire, the officers and administrators and military commanders who had survived the various apocalypses that had restructured the galaxy's power dynamics, had never fully dissolved. They had simply contracted, moved to the margins, and continued operating in the spaces between the recognized power's attention. The message was addressed to Spawn directly, which was the first interesting thing about it. It used his name, which he had not given to anyone on the public record. It described his power accurately, which meant someone had been running analysis since his arrival, and it offered, in the clipped formal language of military bureaucracy, a position as an independent contractor with what it described as significant autonomy and competitive resource allocation. What it was actually offering, as Spawn read between the lines with the practiced ease of a former CIA Black Operations officer, was a weapon. A very powerful, very difficult-to-attribute weapon, operating far enough from the Frieza Force's official structure to be deniable. He read the message twice. Then he typed a response. It was 2 words. No one who subsequently decoded the message ever fully agreed on whether the second word was technically a word or simply a description of a physical impossibility, but the sentiment was universally understood. "Was that diplomatic?" Bulma asked, reading over his shoulder. "No," Spawn said. "Good," said Bulma, and deleted the message from the system logs before her husband could see it and decide to go find whoever sent it, which would have been a whole separate situation. The third attempt was the one that actually caused problems. Dr. Jiro's legacy had not died with him. The scientific principles he had developed in decades of obsessive work, the integration of organic and mechanical systems, the energy absorption technologies, the theoretical frameworks for converting biological power into mechanical power, had been documented, archived, and subsequently stolen, rediscovered, and partially reconstructed by at least 4 separate organizations in the years since his defeat. Most of these organizations were small, under-resourced, and operating on the fringes of legitimacy. One of them was not. The research team that arrived in Satan City the following morning operated under a corporate cover that was impeccably maintained and completely fictional. They came in 3 vehicles, dressed as a geological survey team, carrying equipment that was what it appeared to be on the surface, and something entirely different in its secondary functions. Their lead researcher was a woman named Dr. Voss, who had spent 8 years studying the intersection of Kai-based energy and mechanical systems, and had recently become extremely interested in the possibility of energy types that existed outside the Kai framework. They set up their scanning equipment in the parking structure across from Capsule Corporation and began running passive analysis. They were good at their work. Their instruments were genuinely sophisticated, calibrated for exactly the kind of anomalous energy signature Spawn was generating, and for approximately 40 minutes, they collected data that was genuinely scientifically valuable. Then Spawn walked out of Capsule Corporation's front entrance, crossed the street, walked into the parking structure, and stood in front of their equipment. The team froze. "I can feel you scanning me from here," Spawn said, in the conversational tone of someone making a simple factual observation. "I can feel most things that pay attention to me. It's a function of what I am." He looked at Dr. Voss, who was the only one in the team not currently backing toward the exit. "What are you looking for?" Voss was afraid. It was obvious and she wasn't trying to hide it. But she was also, clearly, someone whose intellectual drive was capable of overriding her fear response, at least temporarily. "Energy conversion ratios," she said. "The relationship between your power source and physical output, whether the conversion is lossy or lossless." Spawn regarded her. "Why?" "Because if it's lossless," she said, "it represents a theoretical energy source with efficiency values we've never encountered. The applications for weapons," Spawn said. Voss didn't answer. "I've been weaponized before," Spawn said. "It didn't go well for the people who tried." He reached out and placed one hand on the primary scanning console. The necroplasm in his system reached through the gauntlet and into the machine in a way that was not entirely physical, finding the data storage and reading it with the same ease that he read spiritual presences. He found what he was looking for, a complete copy of 8 hours of passive scanning data, compiled into a format designed for transmission to an external receiver. He erased it. Not the machines, not the data storage itself. Just the specific data, surgically removed, leaving everything else intact. Dr. Voss watched this happen with the expression of someone watching a proof of concept demonstration that significantly exceeded expectations. "Go home," Spawn said. "Do something better with your abilities." He walked back to Capsule Corporation. Behind him, in the parking structure, Voss looked at her blank data storage for a long moment. Then she looked at the door he'd walked out through. She thought about 8 years of research, about the questions she'd been trying to answer, about the funding that depended on the answer. Then she thought about the specific quality of restraint she just witnessed, the surgical precision of someone who could have destroyed everything and had chosen not to. She thought about that for a long time. Goku found Spawn on the roof of Capsule Corporation that evening, sitting at the edge with his cape gathered around him, looking out over the city's lights. This was, Goku had come to understand over the past 24 hours, Spawn's default settling position, high up, at the edge of things, equidistant from the desire to be part of the human world below and the habit of existing apart from it. He sat down next to him, leaving a companionable gap. "Vegeta wants to spar," Goku said. "I know. He's been vibrating at me from the East Wing for 2 hours." Goku laughed. "That's a good description of Vegeta, actually." He was quiet for a moment. "He won't say this, but he's impressed. The thing you did with the scanning equipment, he saw it on the security feed. The precision of it, he respects precision." Spawn said nothing. "You've been doing this a long time," Goku said. It wasn't quite a question. "Fighting, being alone in it." The city lights moved below them. A transport vehicle hummed past 3 stories down. Somewhere in the distance, A child was having an argument with a parent about bedtime, the voices carrying up in the still evening air with the ordinary specificity of ordinary life. Spawn thought about his apartment in New York, about the alley, about the years of it, the weight of years of being the thing that stood between the helpless and the things that wanted to devour them, without acknowledgement, without support, without anyone who understood what it cost. He thought about Wanda and put that thought away. "Yeah," he said, "a long time." Goku nodded slowly. He didn't offer solutions or suggestions or the easy reassurances that people who hadn't earned the right to give them always wanted to offer. He just sat with it, the way he sat with everything, fully present, without agenda. "This universe is different from yours," he said finally. "Very. But the thing you do, protecting people who can't protect themselves, standing between them and what wants to hurt them." Goku looked at him sideways. "That part's the same." Spawn was quiet for a long moment. "Your friend," he said finally, "the human one, the young one who came by this afternoon." He'd noticed him earlier, a teenager with a shock of dark hair and an energy signature that was simultaneously ordinary and completely extraordinary, like a lit match in a dark room. He has potential, significant potential, and he's afraid of it. Goku blinked. "Gohan, he paused. "He's been going through something, trying to find his place between the academic life he wants and the fighter he can't stop being." "I know that specific conflict," Spawn said, with a flatness that carried more weight than a longer statement would have. "Tell him it doesn't have to be one or the other. The best version of himself is probably both." Goku looked at him for a moment with an expression that was more careful than his usual open brightness. "You're better at this than you let on," he said. "At what?" "Giving a damn about people." Spawn looked out over the city. He didn't answer, but he didn't disagree. In the space between universes, in the cold dark that existed in the wound of Spawn's dimensional passage, something was growing patient. It had been disturbed by his crossing, awakened by the necroplasm signature that had torn the passage open, drawn to the quality of power that existed on the other side. It was very old and very hungry, and it understood patience the way only things that have no natural lifespan can understand it. It pressed gently against the dimensional membrane. Not forcing, just testing. The membrane held. For now, the Grand Kai's planet existed in a dimension adjacent to the living universe, close enough to monitor the flow of souls, and far enough removed to maintain the administrative neutrality that effective afterlife management required. It was, by the standards of divine real estate, a modest place. Rolling hills, a pleasant climate, training grounds for exceptional souls awaiting their next assignment. Grand Kai himself occupied a central complex that managed to be simultaneously impressive in its cosmic function and underwhelming in its physical presentation. The architectural equivalent of a government building that had been designed by someone who understood bureaucracy deeply and aesthetics not at all. He had called the emergency session at dawn. King Yemma attended via projection, his enormous frame filling the communication chamber with the specific quality of presence that belongs to beings who have spent millennia processing the dead. The two Kais who oversaw the northern and southern quadrants of Universe 7 attended in person, seated at the circular table with the careful posture of middle management who had received a memo they didn't fully understand, and were hoping no one would ask them questions they couldn't answer. Supreme Kai Shin attended as well, which elevated the meeting's seriousness considerably. Supreme Kai did not attend administrative meetings. Supreme Kai attended events. "The Soul Registry is producing errors we have no precedent for," King Yemma began, pulling up the relevant documentation with the weary efficiency of someone who had been dealing with this for 36 hours and had not slept. Not that he needed sleep, but the principle of the thing was exhausting. "The entity currently residing at Capsule Corporation on Earth exists in a state that our systems cannot categorize. It is alive, Its vital functions are continuous and active. It is also dead. Its soul carries full death processing flags from a hell that is not our hell, is not any hell we have on record, and is operating on principles that are genuinely external to our universe's afterlife architecture. External, Supreme Kai said. The word carried a specific weight. From another universe entirely, King Yemma confirmed. Our systems are designed to manage souls within Universe 7's parameters. This soul exists partially outside those parameters. It's as if someone took a file from an incompatible operating system and tried to run it on ours. The system keeps trying to process it and keeps returning errors because it doesn't know whether to classify it as living, dead, or something we don't have a category for. What are the practical consequences? Grand Kai asked. Presently, administrative. King Yemma shuffled through his documentation. The errors are contained, they're not affecting the processing of other souls. But the longer this entity remains in our universe, the more interactions it will have with our spiritual infrastructure. Every time it uses its power, it generates necroplasm energy that our systems register as unauthorized afterlife energy operating in the living realm. Every time it interacts with the naturally occurring spiritual energy of this universe, it creates resonance patterns that we have never documented before. And the larger concern, Supreme Kai said. He had a way of asking questions that made clear he already knew the answer and was asking for the benefit of the meeting's documentation. King Yemma looked at him steadily. The dimensional passage this entity came through has not fully closed. It is currently stable, but it is open, and it connects our universe to a universe that operates on completely different spiritual laws. What comes through a passage like that is not just a single traveler. A passage like that, left open, is an invitation. Silence settled over the chamber with the specific weight of bad news that everyone had been hopping wouldn't be confirmed. Have you communicated this to Son Goku? Grand Kai asked. We've attempted to reach the Earth's contact channels, King Yemma said. Goku is apparently in the middle of helping the entity adjust to our universe and has, I quote from his response, a lot of trust vibes about this one. More silence. Trust vibes, Supreme Kai repeated. His exact words, King Yemma said. Supreme Kai closed his eyes briefly. I'll go to Earth personally, he said. This requires a direct conversation. Frieza received the intelligence report about Spawn over breakfast, which in his case was an elaborate affair conducted aboard his personal ship, while his staff maintained the very specific level of attentive invisibility that characterized his command culture. The report was thorough. His intelligence network, diminished but not destroyed by the various humiliations of the past decade, had been working efficiently since the anomaly's arrival. He read it twice. He set it down. He picked up his wine glass, turned it slowly in his fingers, and looked out at the stars with the particular expression he wore when he was thinking about something that genuinely interested him, which happened rarely enough that his staff always noticed and always became very careful when it did. An entity from outside our universe, he said, to no one in particular. Dead but walking, sustained by the energy of its own hell, capable of energy manipulation that doesn't interact with Kai in any documented way. He paused, and currently sitting in Bulma Brief's laboratory being offered tea. His aide, a Shakian officer named Torso, who had survived 15 years of Frieza's service through a combination of competence and a preternatural ability to read the room, said nothing. The Saiyans will try to befriend it, Frieza continued. Kakarot especially. He has that unfortunate habit of turning everything into a friendship story. He set down the glass. The government's response unit has already been rebuffed. The remnant contractors were rebuffed even more firmly. A small smile. It seems to have good instincts about who to trust, which means direct recruitment is unlikely to succeed. He stood, moving to the observation window with the fluid grace that characterized everything he did. What interests me, he said quietly, is not the entity itself, it's the passage it came through. He looked at the stars. A dimensional wound connecting our universe to one that operates on entirely different laws, one that contains hell as an active power source rather than a containment facility. He was quiet for a moment. The applications are not immediately obvious, but they will become obvious. Applications always do. He turned from the window. Put together a team, he said to Torso. Not for the entity, for the passage. I want it monitored, documented, and if possible, maintained in its current open state. He smiled, thin and precise. We don't need to acquire the Hellspawn. We simply need to understand what he brought with him. Torso bowed and left. Frieza returned to his breakfast, poured himself more wine, and allowed himself the rare luxury of genuine curiosity. Supreme Kai materialized in Capsule Corporation's laboratory the following morning with the specific abruptness of someone who had decided that knocking was not a relevant protocol given the circumstances. Spawn had his back to the door and did not turn around immediately. I felt you coming for about 3 minutes, he said without turning. Divine energy has a different texture than Kai, cleaner, more structured. Supreme Kai blinked. In his experience, beings who could sense him at that range were either extremely powerful or extremely attuned to spiritual energy. The combination of both in a single entity that was technically supposed to be dead was, he had to admit, genuinely remarkable. You have perception beyond what your physical form should allow, he said. Death does things to you, Spawn said, turning now. He looked at Supreme Kai steadily, at the purple skin, the white mohawk, the Supreme Kai's ring that pulsed with a divine energy that Spawn's senses registered as genuinely extraordinary, a quality of power that was different in kind from the Kai-based strength of the warriors he'd met, older and more fundamental, tied to the universe's structure rather than to any individual's cultivation. You're not from Earth's administrative structure. You're higher. I'm the Supreme Kai of Universe 7, Shin said. I oversee the maintenance and balance of this universe's fundamental laws. You're here about the passage, Spawn said. Shin studied him. You know it hasn't closed. I knew before I landed. I could feel it behind me, an open wound, not a clean cut. Spawn crossed his arms. In my universe, dimensional passages that don't close properly are problems. Things come through. Things that were waiting for exactly that kind of opening. Our concerns are similar, Shin said. He moved further into the laboratory, and Spawn noticed the deliberateness with which he kept his distance. Not fear, but the careful spatial management of someone who was extending professional respect to a power they didn't fully understand. The passage connects our universe to yours. Our afterlife infrastructure is already registering interference from the incompatible spiritual laws your presence introduces. But the more urgent concern is what the passage might admit. Tell me about your hell, Spawn said. Your version of it, what's in there? Powerful evil souls primarily, Shin said. Villains who cannot be permitted to continue in the cycle of rebirth. Frieza was there for a period. Cell. Others. He paused. It functions as a containment facility, not a power source. The souls there don't fuel anything, they simply persist. Spawn was quiet, working through the implications. In my universe, hell is a military-industrial complex. The demons there aren't just contained, they're active, organized, running operations in the living world through agents like me. He looked at Shin. If the passage stays open, and if what's in my universe's hell finds it, it would be entering a universe whose hell is not equipped to contain it, Shin finished. Our barriers are designed for our own evil, not for something external. Exactly. They looked at each other. The purple-skinned deity who held the structural laws of an entire universe in his portfolio, and the dead man who had spent years fighting a war that nobody outside his own world knew was happening. Between them, something that might have been the beginning of mutual professional respect. Can you close the passage from this side? Shin asked. Maybe, Spawn said, but not without understanding more about how dimensional energy works in your universe. The mechanics are different here. In mine, dimensional passages are torn by supernatural force and closed by opposing supernatural force. Here, everything runs on Kai, which is a different system entirely. If I apply my closure technique without accounting for the interference, he shook his head, I could make it worse. Then we need to approach this carefully, Shin said. We need to approach this fast, Spawn corrected, before whatever's on the other side figures out the geometry. The thing on the other side had already figured out the geometry. It had been called many things across the history of Spawn's universe, which was a universe with a great deal of history, and correspondingly many things requiring names. In the oldest records, in the texts that existed in the deep archive libraries of both heaven and hell, it appeared as a presence rather than an entity, something that preceded the current arrangement of cosmic powers, something that had existed before the current heaven and hell had established their respective domains and had never fully accepted the reorganization. It was called in the oldest texts the devourer of passages. It did not devour people or souls or worlds in the direct sense. What it devoured was the structure between things, the membranes, the agreed-upon separations that allowed different kinds of reality to coexist without collapsing into each other. Find a weakness in a membrane and the devourer would find it too, eventually. Find a wound, and it would widen the wound the way water widens a crack in stone, not with force, but with persistence and patience and the absolute certainty that given enough time, the crack would become a canyon. The passage between universes was exactly the kind of wound it had been waiting for. It pressed against the membrane with the careful, exploratory pressure of something that knew it had time. The membrane shivered. On Earth, 600 kilometers from Capsule Corporation, a section of what appeared to be ordinary sky developed a quality that several people noticed and could not describe, a darkness that wasn't the absence of light, but the presence of something that light couldn't penetrate. It lasted 4 seconds and then resolved, leaving behind nothing but the specific unease of people who had witnessed something they couldn't categorize. Spawn felt it like a punch to the sternum. He was off the roof and in the air before the sensation had finished registering, cape spread, senses reaching outward in all directions. He found the location, the residual trace of the membrane's shiver, the specific frequency of his own universe's supernatural law pressing against this one's physical fabric. He locked it in his awareness and turned back toward the laboratory. Shin was already reaching for his communication device. I felt it, Spawn said. As did I, Shin said. His voice was carefully controlled, but Spawn had learned to read people who maintained careful control and could identify the specific quality of concern underneath. That was a probing event, testing the boundary. It'll test again, stronger each time. Spawn's hands were moving, the cape shifting with the restless intelligence of Letha responding to his heightened state. I need to go to the passage directly, assess it from this side. Alone. Spawn looked at him. You'll want backup, Shin said, with the calm practicality of someone making a tactical recommendation, even if only to have a witness who can communicate what's happening to the relevant parties. Spawn thought about this for exactly as long as it deserved. Fine, he said, but I choose the backup. He chose Goku, which surprised no one who had observed them over the past 36 hours. He chose him not for the power, though the power was relevant, but for the quality of attention. Goku in the field was completely different from Goku at a ramen shop. The ease remained, but underneath it was a focused competence that Spawn recognized as genuine mastery, not the performed confidence of someone who knew they were the strongest person in the room, but the settled certainty of someone who had earned their abilities through a process that had cost something real. They flew north together, Goku's Kai-based flight a bright thread of warm gold energy against the morning sky, Spawn's necroplasm-assisted movement a darker contrast, his cape spread to catch whatever atmospheric currents assisted rather than fighting against them. They didn't speak much. The specific communication of people who were focused on the same thing and didn't need to narrate the focus. The passage was above a stretch of mountain wilderness north of any major population center, which Spawn recognized as either fortunate or deliberate. His arrival had chosen a populated area, but the passage itself had stabilized in an uninhabited region, as if the universe's own geography had preference for where its wound should be. From the ground, it was invisible. From the air at altitude, with appropriate senses engaged, it was unmistakable. It looked like a scar. Not an open wound, not yet, but the specific topology of healed damage that wasn't fully healed, tissue that had knit wrong, bearing the structural memory of trauma. It occupied roughly 100 meters of airspace, and it breathed fractionally, with the rhythm of something alive on the other side pressing against it rhythmically, learning its flex points. Goku came to a halt beside it and extended his senses. His expression changed. "I can feel something behind it," he said. "Not Kai, not anything I've felt before." He looked at Spawn. "It's like your energy, but..." "Older," Spawn said. "More fundamental, less shaped by intention." He was studying the scar with the focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they knew well. "In my universe, entities like what's on the other side of this are called outer presences. They predate the current cosmic order. They don't have goals the way you and I have goals, they have properties. This one's property is passage. It finds boundaries and unmakes them." "Can it be fought?" "Yes," Spawn said, "but not with Kai." He looked at Goku. "Your energy, its life force. Clean, vital, connected to the living universe. The thing on the other side of this is drawn to that. Throwing Kai at it directly would be like throwing fuel on a fire." Goku absorbed this with the focused seriousness of a person recalibrating their approach to a problem. "So what does work?" "Necroplasm," Spawn said. "It's already dead. You can't fuel a fire with ash." He moved closer to the scar, extending one hand, feeling the dimensional membrane's texture through his gauntlet. "I can reinforce this side, push back against the probing, but closing it completely requires working from my side of the passage, which means going through." Goku was quiet for a moment. "Going through to your universe." "To the space between, the dimensional corridor, not all the way through." Spawn's voice was careful, clinical, the voice of someone managing their own alarm at the plan they were describing. "In and out fast. Reinforce the membrane from the inside, seal the wound with necroplasm, come back." "What happens if the thing on the other side is in the corridor when you go in?" Spawn looked at the scar. "Then it gets more complicated," he said. Goku looked at the passage for a long moment. Then at Spawn, then back at the passage. Something moved through his expression that was more complex than his usual open-faced processing. A kind of careful reckoning, a weighing of variables that was less about power levels and more about the specific quality of person he was choosing to put trust in. "I can't go in with you," he said. "You said Kai would make it worse." "Correct. But I can be here when you come out," Goku said. "Hold this side open if the membrane tries to close while you're inside. Make sure nothing else comes through." He paused. "And if you don't come back out in," he looked at Spawn, "how long should it take?" 15 minutes, Spawn said. 20 at the outside." "If you're not back in 20 minutes, Goku said, "I'm going in after you regardless." Spawn looked at him. "That's not tactically sound," he said. "No," Goku agreed. "But it's what I'm going to do." He said it with a complete absence of drama that made it more absolute than any dramatic declaration would have been. Spawn was quiet for a long moment. Something happened in the deep place where Al Simmons had once kept the part of himself that trusted people, a place that had been sealed for years, mortared shut by betrayal and death and the specific loneliness of a war fought alone. Not opened, not yet, but something shifted in the architecture of the ceiling, as if a single stone had been moved. 20 minutes, he said. He turned to the passage. And then, from the south, Hakai's signature descended toward them with the cold, compressed precision of a comet, arriving exactly as unannounced and exactly as inevitably as always. Vegeta landed on the opposite side of the passage from Goku, looked at the dimensional scar with the expression of someone arriving at a situation they had predicted and were professionally unsurprised by, and crossed his arms. "I am not," he said, with crisp certainty, "waiting at Capsule Corporation while the two of you handle whatever this is." Goku looked at Spawn. Spawn looked at Vegeta. "You felt it from there?" Spawn asked. "I've been tracking the passage since yesterday," Vegeta said. "I modified Bulma's instruments last night. When it registered the probing event this morning, I plotted the location in approximately 4 minutes." He looked at the scar with narrowed eyes. "What's on the other side?" "Something that dissolves boundaries," Spawn said. "Your Kai will feed it. Stay on this side." Vegeta's jaw tightened with the specific tension of a man receiving instructions he didn't like and was going to follow anyway because he recognized tactical sense when he heard it. "Then, Kakarot and I hold this side while you go through." Goku smiled. "Teamwork." "Don't," Vegeta said. But he moved to flank the passage across from Goku, and the two of them took their positions with the unconscious synchronicity of people who had fought side by side long enough that the coordination had become structural, built into how they occupied space. Spawn looked at the 3 points of the configuration they'd established without discussing it, the passage, and on either side of it, 2 of the most powerful beings in this universe, standing guard. For the dead man who had spent years with no one watching his back, the specific weight of having people there was almost physical. He didn't say anything. He stepped into the passage. The dimensional corridor closed around him like a fist. And in the dark between universes, something that had been patient for a very long time turned toward the warmth of his presence and began to move. The space between universes had no color. That was the first thing. Not darkness. Darkness implied the absence of light, which implied light existed somewhere nearby as a reference point. This was prior to that distinction. The dimensional corridor existed in a state that preceded the categories of light and dark, a fundamental blankness that pressed against Spawn's perceptions and found nothing to grip. His eyes, augmented beyond normal human capacity by years of necroplasm integration, registered nothing useful. His other senses, the deeper ones, the ones that read spiritual temperature and demonic presence and the specific texture of supernatural intent, worked fine. They immediately told him he was not alone. He stood still for 3 seconds, orienting. The corridor had geometry of a kind. He could feel its walls, not physical surfaces, but the edges of the dimensional membrane, the agreed-upon boundary between his universe and this one, curving away in both directions. Behind him, the passage he'd come through, still open, warm with the residual presence of Goku and Vegeta's Kai pressing against it from the other side. Ahead in the theoretical direction of his home universe, the far end of the corridor, hundreds of conceptual miles away, if distance meant anything here. And between him and the far end, something vast was moving. Not rushing, not attacking, moving the way a tide moves, with the patient inevitability of something that understands that time is not a constraint. The devourer of passages did not experience urgency. It experienced direction. It had been oriented toward this corridor for days now, since the moment the passage tore open, and it was simply proceeding in the direction it had been oriented toward with the complete commitment of something that had no other mode. Spawn could see it now, in the way you see things in complete darkness, not visually, but as a presence that displaced the blankness around it, a shape defined by what it was doing to the space it occupied. It was large, very large. Not in a physical sense, size meant something different here, but in the sense of extent, of reach, of how much of the corridor it filled with its properties. It radiated boundary dissolution the way a fire radiates heat, passively, continuously, as an intrinsic function of its existence rather than a deliberate act. The membrane walls of the corridor, where the devourer's leading edge had been pressing, showed damage. Not holes, not yet, but thinning. The specific degradation of material that had been subjected to persistent dissolving pressure, losing integrity in the microstructural way that preceded catastrophic failure. Spawn had approximately 12 minutes of his 20-minute window left. He got to work. The necroplasm responded to his intent with the total obedience of a system that had been integrated with his will for years, surging outward from his body in controlled streams that followed the curve of the corridor wall, finding the damaged sections with the diagnostic precision of someone who had done this kind of supernatural infrastructure repair before. He had, actually, in his own universe, sealing dimensional rifts that demon incursions left behind, was one of the unglamorous practical skills that nobody wrote comics about, but that mattered enormously for preventing the kind of slow structural collapse that led to the living world having too many access points from hell. The necroplasm hit the thinned membrane and began the process of reinforcement. The devourer noticed. It changed direction. Not toward him, not exactly, toward the necroplasm. The devourer, whatever it was, had properties rather than intelligence, but properties could respond to stimuli. The necroplasm was dead energy, processed soul force from Spawn's universe's hell, carrying the specific spiritual signature of his universe's supernatural laws. The devourer had been pressing against the membrane because the membrane was a boundary. The necroplasm was offering it something better, a conduit. A substance that was already of the same fundamental nature as the corridor itself, already carrying the essence of the universe on the other side. It was attracted to it, the way a fire is attracted to oxygen. Spawn had two options. He could withdraw the necroplasm and try a different approach, but the membrane damage would continue advancing, and he would run out of time before finding an alternative. Or he could hold the necroplasm in place, let the devourer come into direct contact with it, and use that contact as the mechanism for the sealing, essentially turning the devourer's own attraction against it, forcing the confrontation on his terms rather than on the membrane's weakest points. He chose option 2. He planted himself in the corridor and let the necroplasm flow outward in all directions, filling the available space, turning the entire corridor section around him into a field of dead energy. The devourer hit it like a wave hitting a seawall. The impact was not physical, it was categorical, a collision between two incompatible sets of physical law, the devourer's dissolving properties meeting necroplasm's quality of absolute finality. Dead things could not be made more dead. That was the fundamental limitation of the devourer's toolkit. It dissolved boundaries, unmade separations, returned things to a prior undifferentiated state. But necroplasm was already differentiated into its most fundamental form. It had already been processed through death and hell and emerged as pure transformed energy. There was nothing in it left to dissolve. The devourer pushed. Spawn pushed back. What happened next lasted approximately 4 minutes and left no physical evidence because it occurred entirely in the categorical space where different sets of universal law intersected and competed. Spawn's senses, running at full capacity, processed it as a sustained grinding pressure against everything he was, not pain exactly, but the specific exhausting resistance of holding a position against something that was in no hurry to give up. He held. The necroplasm didn't buckle. It found the edges of the devourer's influence and wrapped around them with the sureness of a substance that had been designed, in whatever cosmic sense design applied to the products of hell, to operate at the boundary between existence and non-existence. The devourer pressed and found itself pressing against something that shared its nature. That was, in a way, its mirror image, the end state of everything it produced. And slowly, with the patient grinding certainty of a glacier, it began to be rejected. Not destroyed, Spawn had no illusions about destroying something this fundamental, but the corridor was not the appropriate venue. The corridor was a wound in the membrane between universes, a space that belonged to neither side, and necroplasm, for all its dark properties, was inalienably of his universe's substance. The devourer, pressing from his universe's side, was in its home territory, but it was also pressing against a corridor that was now filled with the most concentrated dead energy in either universe, and the dead energy was not yielding. It withdrew, incrementally, reluctantly, with the quality of something that was not giving up but recalibrating its approach. Spawn used the withdrawal to work fast. The necroplasm was already positioned along the membrane walls. He compressed it, driving it into the damaged sections with focused intent, layering it over the thinned areas the way you would apply a patch to damaged material. It was not a perfect seal. He knew that with immediate certainty. The necroplasm was of his universe's substance, not this one's, and a seal made from incompatible materials had structural limitations. But it would hold for now. It would hold long enough. He turned back toward the entry point. The passage was still there, warm with Goku and Vegeta's presence on the other side, unmistakable in the blankness of the corridor. He moved toward it, pulling the extended necroplasm back into himself as he moved, conserving every unit of the substance that he could because the level of use he just engaged in had drawn down his reserves more than he'd expected. The corridor fought him on the way back. Not the devourer it had withdrawn, but the dimensional space itself, the specific resistance of trying to move through a medium that was not designed for the movement of living things. He pushed through it and felt the passage opening ahead of him, Goku's Kai pressing the membrane outward in welcome, and then he was through. The sky above the mountain wilderness hit him like a physical relief. The open air, the cold, the sound of wind, the texture of a universe with actual physics. He dropped about 3 meters before the cape spread and caught him. Goku was there in a fraction of a second, one hand extended, steadying without grabbing, respecting the line between assistance and constraint. Vegeta looked at him with the focused assessment of someone who had been running diagnostics for the entire duration and was now comparing expected outputs to actual results. "You look like you pushed hard," Vegeta said. "I did," Spawn said. His voice was rougher than usual, carrying the specific quality of overextension that even necroplasm couldn't entirely mask. "The passage is reinforced but not sealed. I need time and I need help from your universe's end to complete it." "Supreme Kai," Goku said immediately. "And Bulma," Spawn said. "Her instruments were close to characterizing my energy earlier. If she can complete that characterization, she might be able to engineer a complementary sealing mechanism from this universe's side. Two-sided pressure, my energy from inside, compatible energy from outside." He looked at Goku. "Does that exist? A divine energy in your universe that could be made compatible with necroplasm?" Goku and Vegeta looked at each other. "Possibly," Vegeta said carefully. "There is a form of energy that exists at the intersection of divine and life force in our universe, the energy associated with the god of destruction." He paused. "Hakai energy." Spawn stared at him. "The destruction energy." "Yes. You want to use destruction energy to help seal a dimensional wound." "Think about it," Vegeta said, with the crispness of someone who had already thought about it extensively. "Hakai energy doesn't dissolve boundaries the way your devourer does. It eliminates specific targets with surgical precision, applied to the devourer's influence on the membrane, rather than to the membrane itself. It could potentially remove the devourer's presence from the corridor without damaging the structure further." He paused. "In theory." "In theory," Spawn repeated. "Most of the best ideas are initially," Vegeta said. Goku was already reaching for his ear, 2 fingers pressed to his temple in the concentrated posture of instant transmission preparation. "I'll get Beerus," he said. Both Spawn and Vegeta said, simultaneously and with identical inflection, That's a terrible idea. Goku lowered his hand slightly. He's the one with Hakai energy. He's also the god of destruction, Spawn said. In my experience, beings with that portfolio are not known for surgical precision in collaborative situations. Beerus is. Goku searched for the appropriate characterization. Particular, but he responds to interesting things. And this, he gestured at the passage, is the most interesting thing that's happened in a while. He also, Vegeta said, with the tone of someone presenting evidence for an argument he didn't personally enjoy making, has a vested interest in Universe 7's structural integrity. If the dimensional membrane fails and whatever is on the other side destabilizes this universe's spiritual architecture, that affects Beerus's domain directly. He looked at Spawn. He is not going to allow that. Spawn considered this. Is he going to try to Hakai me when he arrives? Goku and Vegeta exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Probably not, Goku said. Probably, Spawn said. He usually wants to eat first, Goku offered. If we have food ready when he arrives, the first 10 minutes are much better. Spawn looked at the dimensional scar above them, still visible to his senses, breathing its fractional warning breath, and weighed the options available to him in a universe that was not his, with a threat that was, and a cast of characters that defied every framework his experience had given him for understanding powerful beings. Fine, he said. Get the god of destruction, but someone call Bulma first. Beerus arrived 20 minutes later. He arrived the way he always arrived, without announcement, preceded by his presence, which had the specific quality of a barometric pressure change that living things registered in their nervous systems before they registered it consciously. He materialized in the air above the mountain wilderness with Whis at his side, looked at the dimensional scar with his large amber eyes, looked at Goku, looked at Vegeta, looked at Spawn, and then looked back at the scar. Earth, he said, with the specific exhausted patience of someone who has made the same complaint many times. It is always Earth. Lord Beerus, Whis said pleasantly, you'll notice the entity from the other universe, quite remarkable as I mentioned. Beerus looked at Spawn. Spawn looked at Beerus. The specific quality of this particular exchange was different from any of the others Spawn had engaged in since his arrival. King Yemma's presence had been bureaucratic authority, vast but administrative. Supreme Kai's had been structural divine power, old and fundamental. Goku and Vegeta carried life force as their primary signature. Beerus carried the end of things. Not maliciously, not the way Malebolgia carried darkness as a weapon and a demonstration, simply as a property, the way a black hole carries gravity, inextricably, continuously, as a statement of what it was. The god of destruction did not need to threat. His existence was the threat. Everything in his presence existed at his sufferance, and the universe had apparently decided this was an acceptable arrangement and built itself accordingly. Spawn had met beings with comparative portfolios in his own universe. He did not step back. Beerus noted this. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly in his expression. Your energy, Beerus said, it's dead. I'm dead, Spawn said. And yet here you are. Beerus tilted his head, the amber eyes moving over Spawn with an assessment that was less about power measurement and more about categorical classification. You're not from this universe. No, but something from your universe is trying to get into mine through that. He gestured at the scar. Structural embarrassment up there. Yes, and you patched it from the inside. Temporarily. Beerus was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Whis with an expression that meant something specific in their long communication shorthand. He went into the dimensional corridor alone, Whis said, confirming whatever question the expression had asked, faced the entity on the other side, reinforced the membrane with his own energy, and came back out, all within the 20-minute window he specified. Beerus said. He looked at Spawn for another long moment. "I'm going to touch your energy," he said, without asking. His hand extended, 2 fingers pointing in Spawn's direction, and a thread of Hakai energy extended from them. Not a weapon, not an attack, but a probe, the most delicate application Spawn had ever seen of what was clearly a power designed for wholesale destruction. The Hakai energy touched the necroplasm field around Spawn's body. The interaction was immediate and extraordinary. The 2 energies did not repel each other the way incompatible substances usually did. They did not merge either. What they did was something more interesting. They recognized each other, not as identical, but as occupying the same conceptual space. Both were energies of finality, of the end state of things. Necroplasm was what remained after death had processed something. Hakai was the mechanism of that processing applied at cosmic scale. They were, in the deepest categorical sense, 2 aspects of the same fundamental force. Beerus's eyes widened fractionally. Then he did something that Goku, in 15 years of knowing him, had seen approximately 3 times. He smiled with genuine interest rather than performed condescension. "Interesting," he said. Whis, who had been monitoring the energy interaction through his staff, spoke quietly. "Lord Beerus, the resonance patterns suggest that carefully applied Hakai energy and necroplasm, used in concert, could potentially create a sealing mechanism that bridges both universes' spiritual laws. The Hakai removes the devourer's influence, the necroplasm seals the membrane from inside, and the combined application creates a patch composed of both universes' terminal energies." "I understood most of that," Goku said. "Which part didn't you understand?" Vegeta asked. "The part where we're working with Hakai energy on something we're trying not to destroy." "A fair concern," Whis said pleasantly. Beerus retracted the probe. He looked at Spawn steadily. "You'd need to go back in," he said. "Apply your energy from inside while I apply mine from outside. Coordinated, precise." "I know," Spawn said. "Can you coordinate with someone you've known for 20 minutes? Spawn looked at him. "I've coordinated with people I've known for 20 seconds, he said, "when the alternative is a dimensional collapse." Beerus regarded him for another moment. "You'll need to recover first," he said, with the specific no-nonsense practicality of someone who understood resource management at a cosmic scale. "You're running low, I can tell." He glanced at Goku. "Feed him, whatever he needs. We go back in 6 hours. "He doesn't eat," Goku said. Beerus looked at Spawn. "Necroplasm replenishment," Spawn said. "I need to draw it from available spiritual energy, somewhere with significant life force concentration." "The forest to the north," Whis said, consulting his staff. "High density of living organisms, significant ambient spiritual energy from the natural accumulation of Kai over centuries, ideal for passive replenishment." He smiled. "I'll show you the way." As Whis and Spawn departed northward, Beerus watched them go. "Well," he said to Goku and Vegeta, "this is different." "Good different?" Goku asked. Beerus was quiet for a moment. The dead man went into a dimensional corridor alone to fight something that dissolves the boundaries between universes, patched it with his own life force, and came back because he said he would. He looked at the sky. "In my experience, that is a specific kind of character, the kind that either saves everything or breaks everything, with very little in between." "Which do you think he'll do?" Vegeta asked. Beerus looked at him with the amber eyes that had watched civilizations rise and end since, before most of the universe's current generation of beings had drawn first breath. "Ask me again in 6 hours, he said. In the forest north of the mountains, Spawn sat against an ancient tree and let the ambient life energy of the wilderness move through him in slow, replenishing cycles. Whis sat nearby on a convenient rock, his staff across his knees, looking out at the trees with the serenity of someone in no particular hurry anywhere. "You have questions," Spawn said, without opening his eyes. Several, Wise agreed, though I find that answers tend to arrive more honestly when they're not requested directly. He paused. You could have sealed the corridor from the inside completely. I noticed the energy patterns when you came back through. You had enough necroplasm to do it. It would have cost significantly, but it was within your capacity. Spawn was quiet for a moment. The seal would have been one-sided, he said. My universe's material only. It would have held for months, maybe a year. Then the devourer would find the edges and begin again. He opened his eyes and looked at the canopy. A two-sided seal, using both universes' energies, will hold indefinitely. That's the tactical answer, Wise said. Also accurate, but I notice you came back through the passage rather than sealing it from inside, which means you chose to remain in this universe rather than return to your own. He tilted his head. That was a choice, not just a tactical calculation. Spawn looked at him. Wise looked back with the infinite patience of someone who had attended gods for longer than most civilizations had existed, and had learned in that time that the most important things were rarely the things that were said first. Spawn looked back at the canopy. My universe will survive without me for a while, he said. It always has. The war between heaven and hell doesn't stop when I'm not there, it just continues without a complicating factor. He paused. Here, the problem came through with me. The devourer followed my passage. That makes it mine to deal with. A sense of responsibility, Wise said. Don't make it sound noble, Spawn said. I wasn't particularly, Wise said pleasantly. Responsibility and nobility are different qualities. Responsibility is often considerably less comfortable. He was quiet for a moment. Son Goku told me what you said to young Gohan, about not having to choose between the scholar and the fighter. Spawn said nothing. He also told me, Wise continued, that you said you knew that conflict personally. He looked at the forest with his serene, considering gaze. Al Simmons was, before his death, a man of considerable capability who spent his life being used as a weapon by people with institutional power and personal agendas, who believed they had the right to determine what his abilities were for. He paused. Spawn has spent the years since refusing to be used that way again, at considerable personal cost. The forest was very quiet around them. You did your research, Spawn said. I pay attention, Wise said simply. It's what I do. He stood, collecting his staff. The replenishment should be sufficient in another hour. I'll leave you to it. He paused. For what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth a great deal, coming from someone you've just met, the specific quality of person who can hold a position alone in a dimensional corridor against a fundamental force of dissolution, and choose to come back out rather than seal the door behind them, is not a common quality. He smiled, small and genuine. This universe is fortunate that you came through the way you did rather than any of the other ways that passage could have been used. He walked away through the trees with the unhurried grace of someone for whom the concept of being in a hurry had long since ceased to be relevant. Spawn sat against the ancient tree, in the forest of a universe that was not his, listening to the specific quality of silence that belonged to a place that had never heard his kind of war, and let the living world replenish what the dead corridor had taken. Above the mountains to the south, the dimensional scar breathed its patient warning. 6 hours. Then back in. Then, one way or another, the end of this particular problem. He closed his eyes and waited, the way he had learned to wait, not passively, not with the restless urgency of someone who needed to be moving to feel purposeful, but with the active stillness of a man who had made a decision and was conserving himself for its execution. In the gravity room at Capsule Corporation, Vegeta was running calculations on modified instruments that were now successfully characterizing necroplasm energy in Kai-adjacent terms, not perfectly, but well enough. In her laboratory, Bulma was building something that had never been built before, working from Vegeta's calculations and her own extraordinary intuition, a device designed to interface between two incompatible energy systems and translate between them in real time. In the wilderness above the mountains, the dimensional scar breathed. And in the deep dark of the corridor between universes, the devourer of passages gathered itself with the patience of something that did not experience time as a limitation, pressing its dissolving presence against the necroplasm patch, finding its edges, learning its weaknesses, waiting for its opening. The 6 hours passed the way time passes before significant things, not slowly, not quickly, but with the specific weighted quality of duration that knows it is being counted. Bulma finished her device with 40 minutes to spare and spent 30 of those minutes arguing with it, because the first 3 iterations produced readings that were theoretically correct and practically useless, and the 4th iteration produced readings that were practically useful and theoretically impossible, and the 5th iteration, built with the specific focused fury of someone who had been awake for 19 hours and was not going to be defeated by a machine she had designed herself, produced readings that were both. She called it the Necroplasm Kai Interface Translator, which was an accurate name and a terrible one, and Vegeta suggested calling it something else, and she told him he was welcome to name it after he built one, and the matter was dropped. Spawn examined it when she brought it to the assembly point above the mountains. It was smaller than he'd expected, a disc-shaped device roughly the size of a large book, studded with sensors and emitters that he could feel reaching for his energy, with the tentative curiosity of instruments trying to understand something genuinely outside their design parameters. "It will translate my energy into a form compatible with Hakai?" he asked. "Not translate," Bulma said, with the precision of someone for whom the distinction mattered. "Interface. There's a difference. Translation implies converting one thing into another that would lose the properties that make necroplasm useful in this context. Interface means creating a communication layer between 2 systems that lets them coordinate without either one losing its fundamental character." She held his gaze with the directness of someone who had explained complex concepts to people with extraordinary power and ordinary patience for technical detail many times. "Think of it as a simultaneous interpreter. Your energy speaks one language, Beerus's speaks another. The device lets them work together without either one having to become the other." Spawn looked at the device. Then he looked at Bulma. "In my universe," he said, "the gap between divine energy and infernal energy has never been bridged by anything. The 2 sides have been at war since before recorded history. Every attempt to create an interface between them has resulted in catastrophic failure." He paused. "You built this in 6 hours." Bulma Brief looked at him with the expression of a woman who had built a time machine in a garage and considered that one of her more straightforward projects. "I had good data," she said. Supreme Kai arrived as the sun was beginning to descend toward the western peaks, his expression carrying the careful composure of someone who had spent the intervening hours in emergency consultation with every level of the universe's divine administration, and had not received a single reassuring answer from any of them. "The membrane condition has worsened," he said without preamble. "The Devourer's probing has thinned 3 additional sections in the last 2 hours. The necroplasm reinforcement is holding, but the Devourer has found the edges of it and is working around them." He looked at Spawn. "Your assessment of its methodology was accurate. It has patience as a primary strategic asset." "How long before the reinforcement fails entirely?" Spawn asked. "At current rate of degradation, 14 hours, possibly less." Shin looked at the scar above them, now visible even without supernatural perception as a slight but unmistakable wrongness in the quality of light in that section of sky, a place where the blue seemed thinner somehow, less committed to being blue. "If it fully breaches, the Devourer will enter this universe's physical space. At that point, it becomes a direct threat to the spiritual infrastructure, King Yemma's processing systems, the Kai's connection to the universe's structural maintenance, the natural Kai flow that living beings depend on. A universe whose Kai is disrupted," Vegeta said, would see progressive failure of every Kai-based ability, every spiritual connection, every form of power that draws from life force, Shin confirmed. Starting with the most sensitive applications, divine Kai first, then God Kai, then standard Kai, then basic vital functions. He paused. In the worst-case scenario, every living being in Universe 7 would begin to lose the Kai that sustains their life processes. The silence that followed this was the specific silence of people absorbing a worst-case scenario and deciding how much of their response to show. Goku showed all of it, because Goku always did. His expression moved through alarm and resolve, and something that was simply the fundamental quality of someone who had decided, years ago, that the existence of something that needed to be fought meant that it would be fought, and that was the complete extent of the analysis required. Vegeta showed none of it because Vegeta never did. His jaw set, his eyes narrowed, and the cold, focused anger of someone who had spent his entire life having things taken from him and had developed a very specific relationship with the concept of refusal. Beerus, who had been sitting on a convenient boulder, eating a rice ball that Whis had produced from somewhere, set down the rice ball and stood. Enough context, he said. What's the plan? The plan had 4 components. Spawn had developed it during the recovery hour in the forest, refined it during the transit back, and presented it to the group with the concise precision of someone who had planned operations in conditions where incomplete information and time pressure were the baseline. Component 1. Spawn re-enters the corridor and positions himself at the primary membrane damage site. He applies necroplasm not as a patch this time, but as a matrix, a 3-dimensional lattice of dead energy woven through the membrane's damaged structure, providing a substrate that the Devourer's dissolving properties couldn't find purchase on. Component 2. Bulma's interface device, operated by Whis from outside the passage, translates the Hakai energy application into terms compatible with the necroplasm matrix. The device becomes the coordination mechanism, timing Beerus's external application to Spawn's internal positioning. Component 3. Beerus applies focused Hakai energy to the Devourer's presence in the corridor, not to the Devourer itself. They had no confidence about what happened if you tried to destroy something this fundamental, but to its specific influence on the membrane. The accumulated boundary dissolution effect it had deposited on the membrane's surface. Hakai those specific effects cleanly, leaving the Devourer itself to retreat rather than be destroyed. Component 4. Supreme Kai and Goku reinforce the passage entry point from outside, maintaining the opening long enough for Spawn to come back through. And then, using a technique that Shin had spent the intervening hours preparing with considerable urgency, apply divine sealing energy to close the passage from this universe's side, while Spawn applies necroplasm to close it from inside. The combined closure, using 3 distinct energy types from both universes, would create a seal that the Devourer had no framework for dissolving. It had spent its existence dissolving boundaries between compatible things. A seal made from incompatible energies, fused through Bulma's interface mechanism, would be categorically resistant to its properties. Vegeta's role was to hold the mountain wilderness perimeter against any secondary effects. Secondary effects, Vegeta repeated, in the tone of someone who recognized a polite euphemism for something considerably less polite. If the Devourer is forced to retreat and the passage begins closing while it still has extensions in the corridor, Spawn said, the energy release will be significant. It will propagate outward from the passage point in all directions. I don't know exactly what it will look like in physical space. In my universe, it would manifest as a supernatural shockwave with significant damage radius. And you want Vegeta to manage a supernatural shockwave, Goku said. I want Vegeta to make sure it doesn't reach any populated areas, Spawn said. The forest buffer should absorb most of it, but if it propagates further, I'll handle it, Vegeta said. with the absolute certainty of a man making a statement of fact rather than a promise. Spawn looked at him. "I know," he said. They took their positions. Wise at the entry point with the interface device, his staff extended, the disc of Bulma's creation held in his other hand with the careful attention of someone who respected good craftsmanship. Beerus 10 meters above and to the north, Hakai energy already gathering at his fingertips in that controlled surgical thread, not the vast annihilating application he was capable of, but something finer, more intentional, a scalpel rather than a hammer. Supreme Kai and Goku flanking the passage entry point. Goku's Kai spread wide and bright against the membrane edge, keeping it open, the warmth of his life force acting as a guide light. Shin's divine energy wove through Goku's with a precision that spoke of long practice with the specific technique of passage maintenance. Vegeta, 50 meters south, standing in the position of a man who had been asked to manage a shockwave, and was treating the assignment with exactly the seriousness it deserved. And Spawn at the edge of the passage, looking in. The corridor was darker than before. The Devourer had been busy. He looked back once, not at any one of them specifically, just at the configuration of them, arrayed around the passage in the positions they'd taken without complaint, each bringing whatever they had to a problem that was his, that had come through with him, that was his universe's export to theirs, that none of them had any obligation to help with. The dead man who had spent years with no one at his back looked at the people at his back and felt something that had no name in the vocabulary of supernatural warfare, but was deeply, specifically human. He stepped in. The corridor swallowed him. The darkness was worse this time. The Devourer had saturated it with its dissolving influence, the blankness now carrying an active quality, a weight, pressing against the edges of Spawn's consciousness, with the patient insistence of something that had been doing this long enough to develop technique. The necroplasm patch was still there, still holding the primary damage site, but Spawn could see immediately that the edges had been extensively worked. The Devourer had spent 6 hours finding every boundary of the patch and testing it with focused, methodical pressure. He moved to the primary site and began the matrix. It was different work from the patch. The patch had been about coverage, filling the damaged area with dead energy to prevent direct exposure. The matrix was about integration, weaving necroplasm through the membrane's existing structure at the molecular level, if molecular meant anything in a dimensional context, creating a reinforced composite that retained the membrane's original properties while adding necroplasm's immunity to dissolution. It required concentration that excluded almost everything else. Almost everything. He felt the Devourer's attention shift the moment he began. It had been working the patch edges, the slow grinding work of something with infinite patience, and the sudden surge of necroplasm activity in the corridor interrupted that work the way a loud sound interrupts careful listening. It turned. It came. Not with the gradual approach of its initial movement. This time it came with purpose, with the specific momentum of something that had been provoked into a response faster than its preferred pace. The corridor around Spawn thickened with its presence, the dissolving quality intensifying, pressing against his suit, against his cape, against the necroplasm matrix he was building with the specific malice of disruption for disruption's sake. Letha responded before Spawn consciously directed her. The cape exploded outward, not the spread of flight but the full combat extension, chains emerging from the mass of living symbiote with the snapping certainty of weapons that had been waiting for exactly this. They found the Devourers leading edge the way a tuning fork finds its frequency, not by searching but by resonance. Spawn's universe's version of this entity's nature and the chains that had been forged in Spawn's universe's hell were speaking a common language, and the language said, "You do not pass." The chains held. Not stopped, held. There was a difference. The Devourer pressed and the chains stretched, and the stretch was itself a form of information. Spawn reading the force of the pressure through the chains, the way a sailor reads the wind through a rigging line. Too much, more than before. The 6 hours of work on the membrane patch had taught the Devourer something about necroplasm's limits. He held the matrix work with one part of his mind, and the chains with another, and spoke into the interface with the third. Now, he said, knowing that Whis would feel the necroplasm pulse that carried the word even if sound didn't transmit through the membrane. Beerus, now. Outside the corridor, Whis felt the pulse through the interface device and translated it in the same moment that Beerus, who had been watching the membrane surface for exactly this signal, applied the first surgical thread of Hakai. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The Hakai energy passed through the membrane at the precise point where the Devourer's influence had been deposited most heavily, not touching the membrane structure itself, not touching the necroplasm matrix, threading through the available space with the precision that only someone who had been destroying specific things for millions of years could achieve, and contacted the Devourer's accumulated boundary dissolution effect. The dissolution effect disappeared. Not dramatically, not with the explosive energy release of a combat technique. Simply ceased to be, because Hakai energy applied to a specific thing with sufficient precision eliminated that thing completely and immediately, and the Devourer's influence on the membrane had met exactly that application. The Devourer reacted. What had been patient and methodical became something else entirely. It slammed against the membrane with the full extent of its dissolving presence. All the careful distributed pressure suddenly concentrated into a single application, and the corridor shook. Not physically, the corridor had no physical existence, but categorically, the dimensional space shifting under the impact of a fundamental force applying itself without the restraint of patience. The chain snapped taut. The matrix held. Beerus applied the second thread of Hakai, and the third, working down the membrane with the focused intensity of someone who had set aside everything, except the precise application of destruction at microscopic scale. Whis translated each application through the interface device, timing them to Spawn's matrix construction, the two energies working in the coordinated rhythm of things that were fundamentally compatible in ways their surface properties would never have suggested. The Devourer, losing its accumulated influence section by section, losing its grip on the membrane as the Hakai removed each deposit of dissolution effect, began to withdraw. Not willingly, not quickly, but the mathematics of its situation were changing. It had entered the corridor with a clear advantage, patient, accumulating, with all the time it needed to work against boundaries that had no counter to its specific property. Now the counter existed, and the counter was being applied systematically, and the Devourer's ancient intuition for the geometry of boundaries told it that the geometry had changed. Spawn worked. The chains held the retreat to a pace he could track, maintaining contact with the Devourer's leading edge, preventing the withdrawal from becoming a collapse that would cause its own structural damage. Control. Even in the dark, even with the corridor shaking around him, even with necroplasm reserves running lower than he wanted to think about, control. The matrix reached the final section of membrane damage. He wove the last threads of necroplasm through the membrane structure and felt the composite lock, felt the specific quality of reinforcement that said this boundary will hold. This membrane will not yield to dissolution because it has been integrated with a substance that dissolution cannot touch. He released the chains. The Devourer withdrew fully, backward through the corridor toward his universe's end, the dissolving presence pulling away from the membrane walls with the specific reluctant retreat of something that understood it had lost this engagement and was recalibrating for the next. There would be a next. Spawn had no illusions about that. But next would require finding another passage, and he intended to ensure this one was no longer available. He turned back toward the entry point. "Closing," he said to the interface. Outside, Whis relayed the signal. Supreme Kai began the divine sealing sequence he had spent 6 hours preparing, his power moving through Goku's Kai framework like light through a lens, focused and directed. Goku maintained the passage opening, holding the membrane wide enough for Spawn to come through, his Kai blazing with the specific intensity of someone giving everything to a task with a hard deadline. Spawn came through. The moment his full body cleared the passage, Goku released the membrane and added his Kai to Shin's sealing sequence in the way they had coordinated during preparation, the warm life force and the divine structural energy combining at the passage point in a fusion of purpose. Spawn spun back toward the passage and drove every remaining unit of necroplasm he had into the seal from outside, adding the dead energy of his universe to the living and divine energies of this one. The 3 energies hit the passage simultaneously. The sound it made was not a sound. It was the categorical equivalent of a sound, the specific resonance of a boundary being established with the combined authority of 3 different forms of finality, life force and divine structure and death energy saying in unison, "This closes, this holds, this ends." The passage sealed. Not scarred shut, not patched, not reinforced. Sealed. Completely and structurally, the dimensional wound closing the way a wound closes when the conditions for healing are perfectly met, leaving behind not damaged tissue but clean boundary, as if it had never been torn. The sky above the mountain wilderness became simply sky. Blue clear, committed to being blue. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a threat that had ended rather than merely paused. Then Beerus, who had lowered his hand and was looking at the now clear sky with an expression of professional satisfaction, said, "Wise, I want the roasted boar from that place in the South District." "Of course, Lord Beerus," Wise said. "Tell them to make extra. I'll convey your enthusiasm." Goku let out a long breath and looked at Spawn, who had landed and was standing still in the specific way of someone taking internal inventory after significant expenditure. The necroplasm reserves were low, not dangerously, not below the threshold where his physical integrity was compromised, but low enough to be felt, a particular hollowness in the system that would take time to refill. "You okay?" Goku asked. "Yes," Spawn said. That was, Goku searched for words with the expression of someone who had just watched something they didn't entirely have language for. "I've fought a lot of things. I've never felt anything like that. It wasn't a fight exactly. It was more like..." "Construction," Spawn said. "Yeah," Goku said. "Yeah, exactly." He paused. "You built something in there." "We built something," Spawn said. Goku smiled. Vegeta landed from the south perimeter, his expression carrying the specific quality of someone who had been given a defensive assignment and was mildly disappointed it hadn't required more. "The shockwave propagated approximately 300 meters before dissipating," he said. "Minimal environmental impact, some fallen trees." He looked at the sky where the scar had been. "It's clean." "Yes," Supreme Kai said, his voice carrying the particular quality of institutional relief, the feeling of a crisis resolved before it reached the level that required history books. "I'll need to file an extensive report with Grand Kai's office about the structural precedent this sets, but the immediate threat is neutralized." He looked at Spawn. "The seal will hold." "Indefinitely," Spawn confirmed. "The Devourer will eventually find another passage somewhere in the multiverse, but not here, not this one." Shin nodded slowly. He looked at Spawn with an expression that had moved, over the course of the past 2 days, from administrative concern to professional respect. "What you did in the corridor," he said. "The matrix construction while managing the chains while coordinating the external application. That required operating at several levels of awareness simultaneously while under direct pressure from an ancient fundamental force." He paused. "I have overseen many conflicts in this universe's history. I have not often seen that quality of composure under that quality of pressure." "I've had practice," Spawn said. The sun was fully setting now, the mountain wilderness going gold and then amber, and then the deep blue of early evening, the sky above them unmarked and ordinary and entirely itself. Wise, who had been quietly studying the readings on the interface device since the sealing, looked up with an expression of genuine scholarly pleasure. "The interface data from the sealing process is remarkable," he said. "The resonance patterns between necroplasm and Hakai energy during the combined application. They're not just compatible, they're complementary, like two instruments playing different parts of the same composition." He tilted his head. "I don't think anyone has ever documented the interaction between a dead universe's terminal energy and a living universe's destruction energy before. Nobody ever had both to work with simultaneously," Bulma said, from where she had appeared at the edge of the group. She had arrived 10 minutes earlier, having tracked the energy readings from Capsule Corporation's instruments and understood from the data that something significant was happening. She had the specific expression of a scientist who has just watched her experimental hypothesis be proven correct at a scale she hadn't anticipated. The interface device logged the entire interaction sequence, every microsecond of the coordinated application. She held up her tablet. "This is going to take years to fully analyze." "Good," Spawn said. She looked at him. "Good. If you understand it," he said, "you can build a better one, in case something like this happens again." Bulma looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone reassessing a prior assessment. "You think about the next time," she said. "There's always a next time," Spawn said. "Prepare for it before it arrives." She nodded slowly. Behind them, Beerus was already moving toward the transport point with the purposeful stride of someone whose interest in the current location had been completely concluded and whose interest in roasted boar had become primary. He passed Spawn without slowing, and then stopped. He did not turn around. "The dead man from the other universe," he said. Spawn looked at him. "You held the corridor." Beerus was still facing away, his voice carrying the specific quality of someone making a formal acknowledgement rather than casual conversation. "Against something that was there before either of our universes had names. You held it alone with insufficient reserves, and you built the Matrix while doing it." He paused. "That is not something most beings could do." He continued walking. "Don't waste it," he said, and was gone. Wise smiled at no one in particular, collected the interface device, and followed. Goku watched them go, and then looked at Spawn with an expression that was warm and direct and uncomplicated in the way that only genuine things are uncomplicated. "Dinner," he said. "Bulma's cook makes incredible things, and there's enough for approximately 40 people, which is usually about right for our group." Spawn looked at the clear, ordinary sky above the mountains. At the forest below, ancient and dark, and full of the living quiet of a world that did not know how close it had come to losing its spiritual architecture. At the people around him, the scientist with her tablet, the divine administrator with his careful composure, the prince with his crossed arms and his professional respect dressed as indifference, the man in orange who had sat across a ramen table from the most dangerous supernatural warrior in his home universe, and asked if he was okay with the same genuine interest he'd bring to the question if asked of a stranger on the street. Something opened in the place that had been sealed. Not all the way, but enough. "Yeah," Spawn said. "Dinner." 3 days after the sealing, Satan City held a press conference. This was inevitable. Satan City had developed, over years of being adjacent to events that defied conventional explanation, a municipal communication infrastructure specifically designed for the aftermath of the inexplicable. There were protocols. There were designated spokespersons. There was a carefully maintained relationship between the city's emergency management office and Hercule Satan, who had built an entire career on being the public face of events he had not personally been responsible for, and had refined the skill to an art form. Hercule stood at the podium in the city's main press auditorium with the confident bearing of a man who had absolutely been instrumental in neutralizing the dimensional threat to Universe 7 and was generously allowing others to share in the credit. Behind him, a photograph of the crater Spawn had made on arrival, now filled in and repaved at the city's expense. "The situation," Hercule said, with enormous gravity, "was handled by my team of specially trained operatives, working in coordination with our long-standing allies in the extraordinary community." In the back row of the auditorium, Spawn watched this with an expression that had no specific name, but could have been described as the face of a man who had seen this particular performance in many different theaters. Beside him, Goku was eating from a paper bag of fried dough that he had acquired from a street vendor outside, and seemed genuinely unbothered by the misrepresentation happening at the front of the room. "Does that bother you?" Goku asked, nodding toward the podium. "No," Spawn said. "Really? I spent years doing things that nobody knew about and that got attributed to other people," Spawn said. "As long as the outcome is right, who gets the credit is a detail." Goku considered this. "That's a very mature perspective." "I'm dead," Spawn said. "I've had time to mature." Goku laughed, and 2 rows ahead of them, a journalist turned around to locate the source of the sound, and then turned back very quickly upon locating Spawn. The press conference concluded with Hercule taking questions about his training regimen. They left before the second question. The formal acknowledgement came from a different direction entirely. King Yemma's communication arrived at Capsule Corporation 2 days after the press conference, routed through the standard divine communication channels with the specific formatting that indicated official correspondence rather than administrative follow-up. Bulma received it, read it twice, and brought it to Spawn with the expression of someone delivering news they found interesting rather than concerning. The document was dense with the specific bureaucratic language of an institution that had been refining its official communications for longer than most civilizations had existed. Spawn read through it with the practiced eye of a man who had dealt with heaven and hell's paperwork enough to understand institutional communication in its divine forms. The substance of it, stripped of the formal language, was this: King Yemma's office, in consultation with the Grand Kai, Supreme Kai, and the relevant administrative councils, had reviewed the anomalous soul registry entries generated by Spawn's presence in Universe 7. They had determined that the standard processing categories were insufficient to address his specific situation and had therefore created a new one. The category was designated Extra-Dimensional Soul of Active Obligation. It meant, in practice, that Spawn's soul was formally recognized as existing in a legitimate state within Universe 7's spiritual framework, not classified as living, not classified as dead, not classified as unauthorized, but as something that had its own valid category with its own administrative protocols. As long as he remained in Universe 7, his presence would generate no further system errors. King Yemma's office would maintain a dedicated registry entry for him, updated in real time. At the bottom of the document, in a section marked Administrative Notes, a single additional line read, "Soul demonstrates unusual pattern of voluntary sacrifice for protection of uninvolved parties. Category classification reflects active positive spiritual obligation status. King Yemma's seal." Spawn read that line twice. He set the document down. He did not say anything for a long moment. "Yemma doesn't give positive obligation status easily," Bulma said, watching him with the specific attention of someone who had learned to read what people were not saying. "In our system, it's the administrative equivalent of a formal recognition of service. He's essentially telling his entire bureaucratic apparatus that you're here legitimately and you've earned it." "I know what it means," Spawn said. "Does it matter to you?" Spawn was quiet. In his own universe, The administrative machinery of heaven and hell had spent years trying to classify him, control him, use him, and ultimately, when those efforts failed, simply acknowledge his existence as an inconvenient fact. He had never received formal recognition of anything. He had received demands, ultimatums, threats, and the specific communications of institutions that saw him as a problem to manage rather than a person to acknowledge. King Yemma's seal on a document that said soul demonstrates unusual pattern of voluntary sacrifice was, in the context of Spawn's relationship with afterlife bureaucracy, genuinely unprecedented. "Yeah," he said finally, "it matters." Gohan came to Capsule Corporation on a Tuesday morning, arriving in the specific way of someone who had decided to do something and was committing to it before the decision could be reconsidered. He found Spawn on the roof. He sat down without being invited, which Spawn noted as a quality inherited from his father, the unconscious ease of someone who had never been made to feel that their presence required justification. He was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city, and Spawn let the quiet sit without filling it, which was its own kind of respect. "Dad told me what you said," Gohan said finally, "about not having to choose." Spawn said nothing. "I've been fighting it for years," Gohan said. "The researcher version of me and the fighter version, like they were competing, like being one meant giving up the other." He paused. "I never thought about it as both being part of the same thing." "They are," Spawn said. "The capacity for careful, sustained attention that makes someone good at research is the same capacity that makes someone good in a fight. The ability to hold multiple variables simultaneously, to read a changing situation and adapt without losing your central objective." He looked at the city. "The parts of you that want to understand things and the parts that want to protect things are not different. They come from the same place." Gohan was quiet for a moment, processing this with the focused depth of someone who had his mother's intellectual rigor and his father's complete engagement. "You were both," he said, "before." "I was a soldier," Spawn said, "the best one they had, and I studied. Strategy, history, languages, systems. I thought of them as separate tools. It took dying and coming back to understand they were the same tool." He paused. "Don't wait that long." Gohan looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" It was a genuine question, asked without agenda, with the direct honesty of someone young enough to still ask the questions that adults learn to leave unasked. Spawn considered it honestly. "Because someone should have told me," he said, "and they didn't, and the version of me that could have used that information didn't survive long enough to apply it." He looked at Gohan steadily. "You have time I didn't. Use it better." Gohan sat with that for a long moment. Then he nodded once, with the specific quality of someone receiving something real and treating it accordingly. "Thank you," he said. He left the way he'd arrived, directly, without performance, with the easy purposefulness of someone who had come to get something and had gotten it. Spawn watched him go and felt the complicated specific weight of the thing that happens when the experience that cost you everything becomes useful to someone who still has everything to lose. Vegeta came to him 3 days after that. He did not sit. He stood at the roof edge, arms crossed, looking at the city below with the expression of a man engaged in a conversation he had decided to have, but had not decided how to begin. Spawn let this also sit without filling it. "The matrix work in the corridor," Vegeta said finally. "I reviewed Bulma's interface data from the ceiling, the structural precision of the weave at the membrane level." He paused. "That technique, the three-dimensional dead energy lattice, did you develop it yourself?" "Over time," Spawn said. "It came out of necessity. Dimensional wounds in my universe are common enough that I needed a permanent solution rather than recurring patches." Vegeta nodded slowly. "The fundamental principle, reinforcing a compromised structure by integrating a compatible but distinct material at the compositional level rather than applying surface coverage, is applicable in Kai-based construction as well." His jaw was tight with the specific quality of someone making an intellectual concession they had chosen to make rather than been forced to. I have been working on a technique for reinforcing Kai barriers that has a similar theoretical basis. Your application provided a practical framework I hadn't considered. Spawn looked at him. You're telling me my technique gave you an idea, he said. I'm telling you the principle has cross-application value, Vegeta said, which is a different statement. Is it? Vegeta's jaw tightened further. Then, with the specific expression of a man paying a debt he had decided to pay regardless of the personal cost, he said, Yes, you gave me an idea. The idea is good. I am acknowledging this fact. Spawn was quiet for a moment. The application in Kai-based construction, he said. You'd need a way to maintain the lattice integrity during power level fluctuations. Standard Kai barriers flex under pressure. The lattice would need to flex with them without losing the compositional integration. Vegeta's eyes sharpened. Dynamic integration rather than static. The necroplasm version is inherently dynamic because the substance has its own responsive properties. A Kai version would need that responsiveness built into the technique, which requires the lattice nodes to be linked rather than independent, Vegeta said. And there was the specific quality in his voice of a very good mind finding a problem it wanted to solve, the focused pleasure of intellectual engagement that he wore as rarely and as privately as everything else. Each node maintains awareness of the others, adaptive rather than fixed. Exactly. They stood in the specific companionable quiet of two people who had found, unexpectedly, a common language. Then Vegeta uncrossed his arms. Spar with me, he said. Not a challenge, a request with the dignity of someone who had decided that requesting was more honest than demanding. I want to understand how necroplasm-based combat movement works in close quarters, the chains, the cape. Spawn looked at him for a long moment. Tomorrow morning, he said, before sunrise. Vegeta nodded. He turned to leave. Vegeta, Spawn said. He stopped. The dynamic lattice, Spawn said. When you develop it, and you will, the key is not in the nodes. It's in the space between them. What you do with the space between the nodes determines whether the whole structure breathes or breaks. Vegeta stood still for a moment. The space between, he said. The absence is as structural as the presence, Spawn said. That's the principle. Vegeta left without responding. But Spawn heard, as he descended the stairs, the specific sound of someone whose mind had locked onto something and was already working. The question of going home arrived not as a crisis, but as a conversation. Goku raised it on a Thursday evening, sitting on the roof in the position that had become, over 2 weeks, simply where they sat when there was something worth talking about. The city was going through its evening transition below them, the specific quality of light changing as the day's commerce gave way to the night's quieter movements. Bulma thinks she can open a controlled passage, Goku said. Not a tier, a proper doorway. Dimensional coordinates calibrated to your universe's specific frequency. You'd arrive close to where you left. He paused. She says it'll take another week to build, maybe 2. Spawn looked at the city. A week or 2, he said. Yeah, Goku was quiet for a moment. You don't have to rush. Things are happening in my universe without me, Spawn said. Things are always happening, Goku said. In every universe, simultaneously. He glanced sideways. Does it need you specifically? It was a simple question with a complicated answer, and Spawn sat with the complication rather than resolving it into a simpler shape for the sake of conversational ease. The war between heaven and hell in his universe did not stop. It never stopped. The operations he ran in New York, the protection of the neighborhood, the intervention in human trafficking networks, the constant management of demonic incursion at street level, those continued with or without him, except that without him they went differently. Worse, usually. He was not indispensable in the cosmic sense, but he was specifically useful in the practical sense. The way a key is specifically useful even if the door can eventually be broken down by other means. But the seal on the dimensional passage was complete. The Devourer had retreated. Universe 7's spiritual infrastructure was intact. The work that had brought him here, the work that his arrival had necessitated, was done. He had, as far as he could determine, no further obligation to this universe. And yet, in my universe, he said, I have spent years being the only thing standing between the people in my neighborhood and everything that wanted to consume them. I am used to being the only thing. He paused. Here there are a lot of things standing between people and what wants to consume them, Goku said. Yes. Is that restful or is it uncomfortable? Spawn considered this with genuine attention, the way he'd learned to consider Goku's questions, which sounded simple and frequently weren't. Both, he said. Goku nodded as if this was an answer he'd expected. When I came back from dying the first time, second time, several times, there was always a version of that. The adjustment to being back, to mattering again in the specific way you matter when you're present and alive, and not the person everyone is waiting to return. He tilted his head. You've been present here in a way that I think surprised you. Spawn did not answer directly. He thought about Gohan on the roof, about Vegeta and the space between nodes, about Bulma building an impossible device in 6 hours, about Beerus, who had looked at him in the corridor aftermath and said, don't waste it with the specific weight of a god of destruction deciding something was worth the acknowledgement. About King Yemma's seal on a document that called him a soul of active positive obligation. 2 weeks, he said. I'll stay 2 weeks. Goku smiled. The 2 weeks were full. He sparred with Vegeta every morning before sunrise, the sessions developing over days from cautious mutual assessment into something that functioned as genuine training, each of them learning from the other's framework in ways that neither would have predicted. Vegeta's Kai barrier refinements progressed visibly through the 2 weeks, the dynamic lattice technique taking shape through iteration and argument, and the specific productive friction of 2 people who were both right about different parts of the same problem. He spent 3 afternoons with Bulma in the laboratory, providing the controlled energy readings she needed to calibrate the passage device, and found that the experience of being studied by someone whose intellectual interest was purely genuine, and whose purpose was simply understanding. No acquisition agenda, no weaponization potential in her calculations, just a mind that wanted to know how things worked, was different from every previous laboratory experience in his history. He walked through Satan City twice, alone at night. The city at night was its own kind of information. Every city had a night character that differed from its day character, a specific population and pace and quality of shadow that told you what the place was really like underneath its official presentation. Satan City at night was, he found, genuinely decent, the kind of decency that was structural rather than performed, built into the way people moved through shared space, the mutual acknowledgement of common citizenship that healthy cities develop and unhealthy ones lose. He stopped a mugging on the second walk without planning to. 3 individuals, a residential side street, the specific dynamics of predation that he had learned to read at a glance after years of operating in environments where such dynamics were common. He stepped into the situation and resolved it with the minimum necessary intervention, which in practice meant that 3 individuals decided almost simultaneously that they had somewhere else to be. The victim, a young woman, medical student from the ID lanyard she was carrying, looked at him afterward with the specific expression of someone processing an experience that had not resolved the way she'd expected. "Thank you," she said. "Go home," Spawn said. "Are you the one from the news, who came through the sky?" He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment, at the cape, at the mask, at the full weight of what he was in physical terms. Then she said, with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone raised in a city that had seen extraordinary things and developed extraordinary normalcy in response, "Well, thank you for that too, the sky thing." She walked away. Spawn watched her go. He thought about New York, about his alley, about the specific quality of gratitude from people who had been in the path of something that wanted to harm them and had found, instead, something that did not. He thought, it is the same work. It is always the same work. On the 14th day, Bulma finished the passage device. She called it the Dimensional Transit Calibrator, which was marginally better than the interface translator, and demonstrated its function with the specific pride of someone showing you something they are very pleased with and would like you to appreciate appropriately. The device opened a passage the size of a doorway above the Capsule Corporation courtyard, stable, clean-edged, calibrated with precision that Spawn could verify through his senses. The dimensional coordinates matching his universe's frequency within the tolerance margin, the corridor visible beyond it clear and unoccupied, and leading, after the dimensional distance, toward the specific quality of his home. He could smell it almost. The specific quality of his universe's supernatural atmosphere, the sulfur and ozone, and something older than both that saturated the air of a world with active divine and infernal forces operating at close range. He stood before the passage for a moment. Around him, gathered in the Capsule Corporation courtyard in the specific casual way of people who had decided to be present without making a formal occasion of it, Goku, in orange, eating. Bulma, with her tablet, logging readings. Vegeta, arms crossed, positioned with the careful studied casualness of someone who was absolutely not making this a moment, but had made sure to be there. Gohan, standing next to his father, with the expression of someone who had received something worth keeping and was keeping it. Supreme Kai, who had come with formal purpose and stayed with something less formal. Wise, staff in hand, expression serene and genuinely warm. Spawn looked at all of them. He thought about the things he wanted to say, and recognized them as the things that could not be said, without losing their nature in the saying. He looked at Goku. "The ramen place," he said, "around the corner from the crater." Goku grinned, "Best in the city." "If I come back," Spawn said, "I want the extra chashu." "I'll tell her," Goku said. "She'll be ready." Spawn looked at Vegeta. "The space between the nodes," he said. Vegeta looked back steadily. "I know," he said, and then, with the specific brevity of a man for whom the word itself was a significant concession, "Good." He stepped through the passage. The dimensional corridor accepted him with the familiarity of a road he had traveled before, and behind him, through the closing passage, he felt the specific quality of Universe 7 receding, the warm gold of its Kai, the clean structure of its divine administration, the specific decency of its people, present in the atmosphere the way a character is present in a piece of music. He carried it with him as he moved through the corridor toward home. In the Capsule Corporation courtyard, the passage closed behind him with the clean precision of a door shutting rather than a wound sealing, and the sky above them was simply sky. Goku looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the space where Spawn had been. "He'll be back," he said. "You don't know that," Vegeta said. "No," Goku agreed, "but the ramen lady is going to have extra chashu ready." He looked at Vegeta with the uncomplicated certainty of someone stating a fact. "He'll come back." Vegeta was quiet. Then, because the courtyard was emptying and there was no one left to observe it except Bulma, who did not count as an audience in any relevant sense, the principle he described, the space between the nodes. He looked at his hands, where the dynamic lattice technique was still being refined in his ongoing training. He was right. The absence is structural. The space between determines whether the whole thing breathes or breaks. Bulma looked at him. "He gave you something," she said. He gave this universe something, Vegeta said, with the precision of a man who was going to be exact about this. Not just me. He walked back inside. Bulma stood in the courtyard alone for a moment, looking at where the passage had been, her tablet held loosely at her side, the readings from the closure logged and stored for the years of analysis that awaited them. She thought about the device she had built in 6 hours, and the device she would build next, better, with the full data from the sealing event. She thought about the interface principle, 2 incompatible systems finding a communication layer that let them work together without either losing its fundamental character. She thought that was probably a principle with applications beyond dimensional physics. She went back inside to start the analysis. In the space that was neither this universe nor the next, in the boundary region between what had been sealed and what remained open, something very old and very patient and entirely undestroyed continued to exist with the complete equanimity of something that understood time differently than the beings that had opposed it. The passage was sealed. The universe it had been probing was, for now, inaccessible. There were other passages. There were always other passages. The multiverse was vast and boundaries were everywhere, and the Devourer had been finding boundaries and testing them since before the current generation of universes had names. It turned its attention, with the patient certainty of something that did not experience defeat, only recalibration, toward the wider dark. And in the dark, at distances that made the distance between universes seem intimate, other boundaries waited. Al Simmons had died on a field in Botswana, shot in the back by a man he had trusted, burned beyond recognition, and sent to hell for the sins his trust had enabled. He had bargained his way back with the specific desperation of a man who had one thing left that mattered, and would trade everything else to return to it. He had come back wrong, dead, and walking, sustained by energy that was not life, wearing a face that was not his face, to find that the thing he had traded everything to return to had moved on, as living things do, and built a new life in the space his death had left. He had spent years in an alley. He had spent years being used by heaven, by hell, by every institution and cosmic power that looked at his specific combination of capability and damage and saw, first and primarily, utility. He had spent years fighting a war that had no clean sides and no honest accounting, and no prospect of the kind of resolution that let you put something down. He had crossed into a universe that was not his and found, in the specific way that things find you when you have stopped looking for them, something he had not expected to find. Not peace. He carried too much for peace to be a realistic near-term prospect, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. Not redemption. He had stopped believing redemption was a destination years ago. It was a direction, if it was anything, something you moved toward rather than arrived at. What he had found was simpler, and in some ways more significant than either. He had found people who looked at what he was and responded with something other than fear, calculation, or the specific institutional assessment of how he might be made useful. A man in orange who had asked if he was okay with the same uncomplicated, genuine interest he brought to every interaction. A scientist who had built an impossible device in 6 hours because the problem was interesting, and the person it was for deserved it. A prince who had acknowledged a debt with the dignity of someone for whom honesty was not a performance. A young man who had needed to hear something that Spawn had needed to hear a long time ago and hadn't. He had found, for 2 weeks in a universe built on the warm gold of life force and the clean structure of genuine heroism, what it felt like to be among people rather than adjacent to them. The war in his universe continued. It always would. Heaven and hell were not going to resolve their conflict on a human timescale, and the space between them, the space where Spawn operated, where the consequences of their contest fell on people who had no say in it, would always need someone willing to stand in it. He was that someone. He had never been confused about that. Not really. not even in the worst of the years in the alley. The confusion had always been about whether it mattered that it was him specifically, whether the work had any meaning beyond its immediate functional outcomes, whether standing in the dark between the helpless and the things that wanted to devour them was simply what he did because he had no other options, or whether it was, in some sense, that his history of betrayal and death and institutional manipulation made difficult to trust a genuine choice. Universe 7 had given him an unexpected answer. He had stood in a dimensional corridor against something that dissolved boundaries, with insufficient reserves, alone and held. He had done it because people he had known for 48 hours would be affected if he didn't. He had done it without calculation about whether it served his interests, or whether he was being used, or whether the institutions asking for his help deserved it. He had done it because the work was there, and he was there, and those two facts in combination had always been, in the end, sufficient reason. King Yemma's administrative notation had called it active positive spiritual obligation. Spawn had a simpler vocabulary for it. It was just what he did. He moved through the dimensional corridor toward home, carrying the seal behind him, carrying the memory of Universe 7's specific quality, its warmth, its decency, its extraordinary people treating extraordinary circumstances with the uncomplicated commitment of those who had long since decided that the existence of something worth protecting was all the justification you needed to protect it. He carried Gohan's expression when something landed right. He carried the space between Vegeta's words. He carried a ramen order with extra chashu that he had not eaten and would not eat, and that meant something anyway. The corridor was clean and empty and led home, and home meant the alley and the war and the specific darkness of a universe that needed someone willing to stand in it. And he moved toward it with the settled certainty of someone who had been many things: soldier, dead man, instrument, anomaly, and had arrived, after a long time and a significant amount of dying, at the version of himself that was simply and completely his own. The man in the alley, the knight in the ruined armor, the dead thing that protected the living because it was right, not because it was required. Universe 7 had given him nothing he didn't already have. It had only reminded him that what he already had was enough. In the months that followed, the dimensional seal held without variation. Bulma's analysis of the interface data produced 3 separate published papers in the theoretical dimensional physics literature, under a pseudonym, because the actual author's identity would have raised questions about the data's provenance that would have taken longer to answer than the papers themselves. The papers described, in precise technical language, a method of cross-system energy interface applicable to dimensional membrane stabilization. The third paper included a section on the structural principle of dynamic lattice reinforcement, attributed to collaborative development, that several researchers in Kai-based barrier technology found immediately and practically useful. Vegeta never mentioned this to anyone. Gohan enrolled in a dual research and training program that he designed himself, with the specific combination of intellectual rigor and physical commitment that he had finally stopped treating as contradictory. His mother was delighted. His father did not fully understand the academic component, but was enthusiastically supportive in the way he was enthusiastically supportive of everything Gohan chose. Supreme Kai filed his report to Grand Kai's office. The report was extensive, carefully documented, and included a formal recommendation that the administrative category of extra-dimensional soul of active obligation be maintained as a permanent registry classification rather than a temporary measure, in anticipation of future cross-dimensional interactions. Grand Kai approved the recommendation with the specific tone of someone who had learned, after a very long career, to prepare for things he hadn't encountered yet. King Yemma added the classification to the Permanent Administrative Codex. somewhere in the multiverse, at distances that made the gap between Universe 7 and Spawn's universe seem like neighboring rooms. Something very old and very patient continued its work with the complete equanimity of something that understood that all boundaries were temporary, all seals provisional, all victories local. It was not concerned. It had time. In New York, in the alley, the night was its ordinary dark. The city made its ordinary sounds, traffic and voices, and the specific urban percussion of millions of people occupying shared space and negotiating, mostly without violence, the terms of that occupation. The alley was quiet in the way that spaces adjacent to Spawn's presence became quiet, the local supernatural atmosphere calibrating itself to the thing that stood at its center. He stood in the dark and let his senses extend outward into the city. The usual population of threat, the human kind, the supernatural kind, the kinds that existed in the spaces between those categories, moving through their usual patterns. The neighborhood extending outward around him, its specific life, its specific people, its specific combination of vulnerability and resilience that had made it his for years, not by assignment, but by choice. He thought about a universe built on warm gold light. He thought about a man in orange who had looked at him with complete uncomplicated interest and asked what his energy was. He thought about the space between the nodes. He thought about the ramen lady who would, according to Goku, have extra chashu ready. Something moved in the shadows at the alley's far end, a demonic incursion, low level, the kind of opportunistic supernatural predation that filled the bottom tier of his operational calendar. It had come through a minor rift, the kind that formed constantly in a universe with an active supernatural war running through it, and it was moving toward the street with the specific purposeful hunger of something that had found an undefended access point. Spawn moved. The chains extended. The cape spread. The darkness met the dark thing with the absolute certainty of a force that had chosen its position and held it, not because it had no other options, not because it had been assigned, not because heaven or hell or any institution with a portfolio and an agenda had directed it here, but because it was right. Because the work was here. Because he was here. And those two facts in combination had always been enough. In Universe 7, on the roof of Capsule Corporation, in the specific quality of evening light that settled over the city as the day's last hour softened everything it touched, Goku sat and looked at the sky. The sky was clear. The dimensional boundary was clean. Somewhere in the dark between universes, in the clean sealed corridor that connected nothing to nothing, the composite seal built from life force and divine energy and dead man's fire, held with the structural integrity of something that had been made right. Goku looked at the sky for a long time. Then he smiled, the full, uncalculated smile of someone who had met a dead man from another universe and found in him the thing he always looked for in people, the thing that made the finding matter regardless of the form it came in. The thing that said, "I will hold." "See you around, Spawn," he said to the clear sky. The city moved below. The stars came out, one by one, over Universe 7. With great power comes great responsibility.